Look at all these fine people. It is Pay, Dimitri, Zach Fishman. Look at all these fine people. It's Haru. So I got to guess, like friggin' Samuel Barnes came across the pond to be in this living room at this time. Oh, Samuel Barnes, he's the one who did the iconoclast. You saw that video.
No, yeah, I've been learning about your philosophy.
Dude, I love this guy.
God help you.
Yeah, get a little closer. So
I'm slightly more soft-spoken than you are.
I guess I just scream, don't I? I just scream at the thing in different things. So and Sam, Daniel Zaruba, how good to see you. My goodness. Sam, how are you doing today? And Daniel Zaruba, what a treat. What a treat. Y'all doing okay?
Hi.
I have here Samuel Barnes. He wrote The Iconoclast, which is a tremendous book. So he actually came across the pond from the UK. And he is here today. So he's visited, just for this, actually, it had nothing to do with work. He just came over to like see if he could ride a cow or something like that. So, it really worked out. And Pei, congratulations on the Pérelin decline. Pei finished this wonderful book. Sam over there at Greener Side has a tremendous review on it, and I've enjoyed it very much. So Pei, congratulations to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, you both had fantastic reviews on it. I quite enjoyed both of those.
Oh, no, we enjoyed it very much. And I found it very interesting in the preface of your book, because it's so funny when you hear something, you're like, oh, that's so obvious, where it's like, everything is new under the, there's nothing new under the sun, and then everything is change. And we kind of accept both of those premise and don't think about it. And how I really liked in your book where you had that in the preface, and once you hear it, you're like, it's so obvious, like, oh, that's kind of weird. You're right. We accept both of those and don't think about it. And how your book from that explores that paradox and sort of brings out the fact that it has so much to do with memory. I just thought that was so well designed.
No, I thought that prologue was what it may have sounded a bit off, which is why I said it might be unnecessary to even have it. No, it's good to hear that it did transfer into to translate into the story itself. So that was great to hear.
Oh, no, I enjoyed it very much. So everyone, if you have not read The Pérelin Decline, I think it is definitely worth your time and very, very enjoyable. And I liked Mr. Fishman's comment. Sam, great to see you. It is a delight. My wife has been talking endlessly how much she enjoyed speaking with you. So Sam, thank you for doing that, Miss Willman. That was a delight. But Zach had a wonderful comment kind of pointing out something that we've been discussing, where if you can almost create a sense of meaning in your life or direction by just forgetting everything, is indeed the meaning crisis, a correct framing, because I can create meaning just by kind of forgetting everything. And then suddenly everything has a kind of potential meaning and that I can kind of follow. And it's interesting to think about, even though I think the meaning, I use the phrase the meaning, I think that's quite lovely, but it also kind of speaks to how there's something else one has to get into when they talk about the question of meaning. And I kind of also think about the notion of I can have meaning, but not necessarily have a story, or I can like see meaning in what I do, but maybe it's not necessarily a beneficial meaning to other people. So it kind of opens those different questions. But Mr. Fishman, do you have any thoughts on that idea?
Sure. Yeah, I think that meaning, as you say, there's meaning in exploration, there's meaning in wonder, there's meaning in discovery, but then there's also meaning in fulfilling a purpose, right? And I think that purpose is where we get story, it's where we get lineage, it's where we get the connection from the past to the future. And so I think that, like, I haven't read your book, but as I understand it, there's kind of this idea of the character forgets everything, and then she finds these rocks in her room, and suddenly they're meaningful because what are they for, right? And the idea is, I think the kind of philosophical point here is that, like, once we figure out what something is for, we kind of integrate it into ourselves. We use it as an instrument, and we kind of lose that I-thou relationship, you could say. Like, we lose the sense of wonder, we lose the sense of moreness about the object. And it can be helpful to be kind of perhaps iconoclastic. I don't know if that word kind of fits in here, but there's a sense in which it can be helpful to sort of forget your relationship to something so that you can then rediscover it in a new light, right? But then there's also the fact of, like, the reason why we do this, the reason why we integrate things into ourselves is so that they're more useful to you, right? Like, if you forget how to drive the car, you're going to crash the car. And so, like, there's meaning in forgetting things and sort of like opening up to this world of wonder, but there's also meaning in like driving the car to the store and getting food and bringing it back and fulfilling the purpose of all those things. And so I think this is, yeah, like I say, the meaning crisis is maybe not a good framing. I like Daniel's language of the meta crisis. But then I was watching the last net session, and Chetan, I think is his name, brought up a really good point, which is that it's like we can frame things in terms of like there's the meta crisis, which is just everything going wrong at once. And then there's a solution, which is like the overman or something, which is just sort of this individual self-overcoming. But that framing works for just about any problem ever. And that because of that, we should be suspicious of it. And we need to particularize the meta crisis and address it in terms of, and that's where like the language of purpose would come in.
It is interesting to think of how there can be a temptation to solve crises by simply saying, oh, if only people were more philosophical, then everything would work out, right? You know, you can say, oh, you know, if only people thought more like me, things would be right. And there's a problem with that, right? Because there is something where when Nietzsche is talking about the overman overcoming the human, you know, not falling into the temptation of the last man, that you know, that's a good thing. Like it's a good thing to overcome that. But then if you start saying, well, if everyone was an overman, then everything would work out. Well, then the question is, okay, so what are the conditions that would make everyone become an overman? Can you spread those conditions? Are they fundamentally limited? You know, we've been talking about this problem of scale versus spread. You know, can you spread the conditions that will turn people into overmen? What does it mean to be an overman? Is that possible? Is it inherently elitist? And then you get into questions of, is elitism inherently bad? What is elitism? Is there a difference between saying I'm better as a person versus say I'm better at doing pool, which is a skill, which isn't sort of like a ontological hierarchy. It's just a better that's erected on the doing of a thing. Say there are people that are in fact seemingly better at handling diversity. You know, they're not existentially overwhelmed by difference versus other people. And that is a sense in which the word better can be used and not be making some sort of like ontological claim of that's like kind of, you know, it's based in an act, a kind of work and different things. And it's interesting to think about different things like Mr. Zaruba does wonderful work with Guy Simstock on certain practices, like philosophical practices, where we tend to make philosophy something in the head and it doesn't become a practice. And it's interesting to think about how one of the reasons of engaging in, say, philosophical practices is so important is indeed in order to find meaning that's not just an absence. So you forget everything and therefore there's meaning, which is kind of a negative meaning. It's kind of a problematic meaning because it's kind of a loss of memory, as opposed to when we're talking about like a positive meaning, if I use that language, it would be something where that requires you to do something. Right? Like you have to engage in certain practices and have a certain towardness to the world to gain that, right? Well, that's way harder because then you have to do something as opposed to have something taken from you, right? If you have your memory taken from you, boom, everything's meaningful, but that seems problematic because then what are we going to do? Create a world government that goes around and make everyone have amnesia? That doesn't seem like a good idea. I don't know. Maybe people would vote for that. Hard to say. But there's something about like, once we start talking about you needing to do something to be able to have the ability to live meaningfully in a way, if we use that as a kind of difference, and that requires certain practices that you have to engage in. And I think if we think about the overman in the Nietzschean sense of certain actions and practices that you have to engage in, that requires something of you as opposed to losing something, that becomes quite difficult. And then we'll start talking about a kind of skill. Then we're talking about a way of being, a certain action. And then I think what we've arrived at through a number of these conversations, and then whoever would like to speak, please, is the notion that when we're talking about addressing the meta crisis, and I should clarify the meta crisis, you know, is a phrase like a Daniel Schleiermacher, you know, a lot of people talk about for the sum total, you know, AI technology, global warming, the inability to find coffee in the morning, everything that goes wrong, you know, and in that, you know, the idea is that if people continue to think like they've always thought, you're going to continue to fall in the game theory dynamics that led to the meta crisis. So you need a new way of thinking to avoid that. And we're talking about like, there's something about absolute knowing, overmen, so on and so forth, that would be that new way of thinking. But here's the problem, is it kind of idealistic to talk as if everyone could be that way, and then you would solve the problem, right? That seems kind of idealistic. So what do we, so is there a way to spread the conditions? And this will also start pointing at, like, if we talk about like the Dall-E technology, and I'll pause before going into that, is that something that helps people say become overmen, or is it removing, like, is it removing something? Are we gaining something with Dall-E that would help us develop a skill and engage in new practices that would help us deal with the meta crisis? Or is it more like losing your memory? Whereas you're losing something when you outsource the creative act to Dall-E. That's actually not going to contribute to new ways of thinking, would be one question to approach. And I will note that for Pei, it's wonderful. I don't want to give away the end of the novel, but it's very interesting the way that Pei approaches the question of meaning in terms of if one just pursues meaning by searching for their memories, there's something that could be problematic for that. So Pei has an interesting way where he explores that concept, but I also don't want to give it away too much.
I just want to say, like, returning to an earlier point, like you were making at the beginning of that, is especially when we comes to meaning, I think that the word better has just sort of proven itself to be the worst word in the English language, because it just inevitably leads to this sort of utilitarian thinking. It's like, and you know, you've got these like tech people being like, how can we make AI better? That's like asking how can you make human intelligence better? Like it doesn't, like it like implies like a utilitarian like standard for that sort of thing. So I think like the word better is just like an awful word to use. I think
I'll call up the OED and see if we can get it taken out.
I'm sorry, but like, aren't you, by saying that better is the worst word ever, aren't you still implying that kind of, you know what I mean? It's like better, it's the word, better is a bad word to what standard exactly? You know what I mean? You can't get out of it, I feel like. I don't know. Not to be all argued.
Yeah, I would like to say something about this. So to me, this conversation, I mean, I'm just hopping in. It's about better and worse. I in my own life, I prefer the words constructive and destructive. You know, because that doesn't have a moral connotation to it. And of course, like, I mean, they can have like some kind of implicit moral bias in them, but still it is less obfuscating than better or worse. And
Auschwitz was a construction. Yeah, I mean, to bring in Samuel Barnes' work here, like sometimes the right move is to be iconoclastic. I said Auschwitz was a construction. You know what I mean? Like to construct something, you can construct a Tower of Babel, you can construct an Egyptian pyramid. I mean, to construct is not a good in and of itself, nor is to destruct a good in and of itself. Again, alluding to Samuel Barnes' work here.
Yeah, I just want to address your point, Zach. Like, like, you know, like just using the word, saying that better is a bad word is, yeah, okay, it's kind of implying something. But this is my point, is it's not the like linguistic pointer better that I have an issue with. It's the use of better as if you're not implying some sort of metaphysical standard, as if you're not applying some sort of value system, is when, like, you know, how can we make AI better? And it's like, you know, the ethical questions aren't even addressed there. Like the, you know, creative questions aren't even addressed there. It's like, okay, how can we make this more constructive, to use Dimitri's language?
Okay,
right?
okay.
Is it more constructive to be iconoclastic or more destructive to be dramatic? Don't apologize. You had a good point. You had a good rebuttal.
I would like to add to that also that, you know, like when, like constructive, I mean, to construct is something else than constructive, and I think constructive implies a certain telos that isn't necessarily moral in and of itself. But everything that you are saying is definitely correct, and all of these words can be huge problems. And I want to add to this because there has been recently a discussion about this in the IDW, and Cadell Last recently published a very nice article on like Hegel's coming to be as a philosopher and what he found important. So what's crucial for Hegel is the step we make from the understanding, which is a kind of faculty of the mind, like how you map the world and make distinctions, to reason. So Hegel calls the understanding the greatest power, because the understanding, what it can do, it can make a concept, you know, like I have a phone here in my hand and whatever. But the problem with understanding and mapping the world in this form is that understanding doesn't have self-understanding. And that's basically where the dimension of reason comes in, which is which can actually develop an understanding of the self-relation, you know, of yourself. So I think that's so crucial, you know, like, because you have to be able to conceptualize your own negativity. Basically, I think that's really the base level of developing yourself as a philosopher. To be able to think negativity and not just whatever, build up a map of the world outside of you. You have to destroy yourself, like symbolic suicide, like Zizek or Lacan would say.
I'd like to like kind of follow the path that you started to lay out, which is like after you have an understanding, there's sort of like a then what. And I work a lot with bridging like the conceptual and the actionable. And there's a certain point where I'm but you were saying better is you wish you could erase it from the language. When you're moving between the conceptual and the actionable, I find it very difficult to use just value claims like better, because like, yeah, like Auschwitz is a construction. Is it, you know, are we going to do something that's better in terms of like genocide? Because it was a lot better. You know, like what is the thing that you're doing? And once you consider that, you need to be more articulate than just like, what is the value of the thing that you're trying to do? You need to, like, language needs to, the language that you're using needs to reflect what you're actually doing and changing in the world. And I think in that way, I definitely agree, like, because it's a very difficult process to go between what something means and how it does that meaning. It's just a hard step. You know, I think artists, creatives, and also just like engineers understand that that's a very difficult step. But I definitely agree that you need, I think it's good to be more articulate than simply just like stating an ideal.
That kind of point, Sam, is very good, because the kind of point makes me think of Pei's book, in the sense of there's a way in which Simon goes to the book seeking understanding, but it's not until there's an act of sacrifice that we then move into reason. And so where actually the pursuit of meaning can keep one in the realm of understanding, because you could be seeking meaning, whereas there's a kind of meaning that actually entails an act of sacrifice, an act of accepting an essential otherness, actually. And I think Pei's book explores that quite well. That then is a movement. It's kind of funny because there's almost a movement into reason, and the word reason is interesting too. If we play on kind of a double, because you can talk about reason as the reason of life, your meaning, but then there's also reason as a sort of understanding. So it's kind of an interesting thing. It's like you get both because you sacrifice one in a way. And so you have Simon at the end who's giving up or understanding is not primary, that actually then moves into a reason precisely because there's almost a sacrificing of that understanding that comes in the story. And I know I'm alluding to a book that not everyone has read, but actually I would suggest Pei's work. I think that also speaks to Mr. Barnes' work that you're free to comment, in the sense of that there's this perpetual kind of skill in a place of embodiment that requires a discernment of when iconoclasticism is needed and when dogmatism is needed. And that can only be determined from an embodied place, from being in a place. And there has to be a constant moving between an oscillation. Mr. Ebert has done tremendous movement as well, understanding as well, on this thinking of the science of logic in terms of freak theory, that also I think embodies a certain level of this kind of moving, collapsing, coming together. He will explain it better than me. Mr. Ebert, good to see you. And Javier, good to see you as well. Mr. Barnes actually going to visit Mr. Javier as well. Man, seen more of the United States of America than I have. My gosh, look at this guy just flying over, seeing all these different people in different things. So there, it seems to be in a lot of these net conversations, there is this kind of notion of some sort of ability to, in a particular situation, be able to discern something that is needed that at other times would actually be what makes it worse, but in this time makes it better. And you have to be moving between those from an embodied place, which requires a skill that then certain practices, like Mr. Zaruba will work on, may help one be able to get to the place where they can engage, they can work in those practices, and also have the psychological, existential, and emotional ability to do so. But with that, I will pass it on to Mr. Ebert. Mr. Ebert, it is a pleasure to see you, sir. I hope you are well.
I'm very well, thank you, Daniel. It's so nice to know that this Thursday happens, you know, and that it's nice. I hope it never ends. Yeah, I mean, I feel, you know, for instance, to Dimitri's point and your point, one can skip understanding. But when I see someone who has skipped understanding and jumped right to reason, I see a false reason. usually, unless it's some sort of incidental genius, right? Like a Jimi Hendrix moment where it's like, oh, he could just skip the tutelage and skip right to reason. He knows how to use the instrument in that ephemeral sense. He didn't have to learn anything, or whatever the analogy is. But you know, there is a stage of understanding that gets sublated into mastery, but mastery is not, I should say, expert. Mastery is at the end, after you take the sublation of initiation into expert, which is this collapse of learning, and suddenly you're an expert. And you have this like sort of facile understanding of the subject, but you haven't yet experimented with that collapsed self-relating unity. You haven't negated that unity. So now you're an expert. Now you have to be like, okay, fuck it. How am I going to fuck with my expertise? How am I going to play with this now? You know, and so then you go into experimentation, right? And then that starts to sublate into maybe a rebellion, and you're in the stage of rebellion against your expertise, right? And then you're taking that rebellion and you start codifying it, and that codification starts to sublate and condense, and suddenly, finally, you have mastery, where you understand the rebellion that was the experimentation, that was the initiation, you know? And so it's a process, but I think that, you know, it's not like we have to go through the proper channels to understand understanding and then come to reason, but we have to go through our own sort of process that comes through and travels through understanding into reason. And, you know, it's just this process. And once we become a master, you know, we probably become bored. Maybe we stop doing it. I don't know. I don't relate to like the sushi chef who just keeps doing the perfect sushi the rest of his life. Like, how do you do that? I guess there's a thing, and like, you know, but it's a very Zen sort of thing. I need to self-repel and experiment again and explode it, because I need that. I like that self-contradiction. I like growing, you know. But maybe I'll come to that place where I'm just a tree and I just have that state, and you know, I come on here and I can't say anything because words are meaningless, and I'm in this sublated state, and I'm just in my true infinity, and that's that. Anyway, it's good to see you guys.
It's a pleasure, Mr. Ebert, and it's so thrilled to have you here. I will note there's something interesting in Hegel where the state of habit is actually a state of like where you have freedom, but it's precisely where you're no longer thinking about it. So there's a weird way in which freedom is found in a mixture of a kind of determinacy, and yet it's a determinacy that you have to get through a sort of repetition. But then if you just stay in that repetition, it becomes meaningless to you. So there's a funny way where you have to do what you're saying. But on that comment, like I said, I'll give it to Mr. Fissman, Dimitri, Zaruba, and then Javier.
Okay, yeah, I think what everyone is saying here is great, and it seems to me that the problem that we're kind of circling around is the problem of what John Vervaeke would call relevance realization, right? That we're looking at a field and we're trying to find a way through it, right? So like, given that there is like, we could bring in Samuel Barnes' language here of the meta-dogmatist who sort of travels between different dogmas. Immediately you run into the problem of there is an indefinite number of dogmas that you could travel between, and you must select one to the exclusion of the other, right? So it's kind of the question of the ultimate telos, right? And I feel like the problem with this is that on the one hand, if you propose an ultimate telos, then there's the danger of idolatry. There's the danger of you get locked into this sort of rigid thing. But then if you don't propose a telos, then you're just kind of lost in this aimless chaos, right? And so I feel like we're trying to come up with these words like overman and absolute knowledge and things like that to serve as this sort of telos, which isn't a telos. And I mean, I'll be honest here, like, I think the overman is an impossibility. Like, I think that it's in the next world, but it has no root in this world, right? So like, the word I would use here that I would introduce is guide, right? That's what I aspire towards. I aspire to become a guide, and I am a guide insofar as I act as one. Right. So that's the thing about a guide, is that it is a verb as well as a noun, as opposed to guru, which is merely a noun. Right. So guru, and I would put the overman in the same sort of category of an attainment, that once you have it, it's like now you are a guru for now and ever. Whereas guide is a relational term. Right. I'm only a guide if you accept my guidance. If you reject it, then I'm not a guide in that moment. Right. And so that way it's like we can have the ultimate telos and we can have the state of becoming. Right. Because I can recognize anybody who guides me in any way as guide in that moment. I can say, thank you, guide, and I can speak to the ultimate acting. I can speak to the guide in all of us, acting in particular ways through each of us, maintaining the way in the process, right? That's how I would describe it, and I could elaborate on those terms, but I don't know, maybe that language would be helpful here. The guide is, because that's what I aspire to be. That's my ultimate telos that I would put there.
And it is interesting to think, like Mr. Barnes will talk about how pure iconoclast and pure philosophy is impossible, and in fact, it can almost be destructive. There's a sense in which there's a question of what does it mean to become the overman in a manner that participates with other people as opposed to a force that alienates. And that's why it's interesting that Nietzsche has Zarathustra come down the mountain to be with other people, to locate other people, and to be a guide for them. But with that, I will pass it to Dimitri, Zaruba, and Javier.
Yeah, Nietzsche says explicitly that the overman is the meaning of the earth. The overman shall be the meaning of the earth. So with Nietzsche, you always go through the body, and he's very adamant about emphasizing that. So, and I think Nietzsche is not someone who basically gets stuck in the understanding. And again, I would like to emphasize symbolic death, or Lacan even said that suicide is the only successful act, which is one of the things that Lacan is really Kenyan. But yeah, so that's really the difficulty. I mean, I'm going through a breakup right now, and I was reading this book by Alenka Zupancic, and she says that, like, the difficult thing when you're going through a breakup is that you want to actually stay in love, and you want to have the symptom without the pathology, basically, because you want to have the negation and kind of wallow in it and stay in that. What's actually difficult is to really die the second time, where you don't even where you basically become indifferent to that singular history in a certain way that is not indifferent, like, oh, I don't care about it, but that you're on a higher order. And yeah, that's a symbolic death. And I mean, it's crazy, like, people philosophers who actually are great philosophers have always gone through that. And like, I think it's such a weird thing. Like, why would anyone do that to themselves, whether it's me or you guys?
First off, Dimitri, we need to get a shelf so we can have Spinoza, Hegel, and Nietzsche behind us, and I'll set up the Pérelin Debut and Iconoclast up there. I need to do that, frick. That begs the question of what Mr. Barnes asked in the conversation with Cadell. Are we better because of philosophy? Are we worse because of philosophy? What is actually going on? I think that's a bit fascinating question. But Javier, I want you to know that Barnes came to our house first, not because he likes us more. It was just the travel. So don't worry about it, okay? It doesn't mean anything at all, Javier, okay? Don't be upset.
Boy, there's a lot to address here. Let's start with Zach. So I agree, overman impossibility. Why is the overman impossibility? To sort of ring on Dimitri here, just to sort of play with like some Buddhist concepts, right? We say samsara is nirvana, nirvana is samsara. Nietzsche's emphasis on the earth is because heaven is earth, earth is heaven, right? There's no need to sort of do this distinction between other worlds, right? The earth is heaven, heaven is earth. The overman is the meaning of the earth. The reason why the overman is an impossibility is because the overman is already inside of you, right? This is sort of playing with like Buddha nature, right? The overman is already there. That's why it's an impossibility. So that's a couple exciting points I wanted to share with Zach that I'm sort of playing with. Now, my concern when we start talking about like Hegel and like this movement of like understanding and reason and so on, who's doing the moving? That's like my always concern. Because, when we start talking about philosophy, and I actually brought this up to Cadell, and I think Daniel actually did a nice kind of like a nice breakdown with Jim Rutt in IDW, where he was saying, actually, the movement of consciousness is already happening, right? This is something that's already occurring. So I get a little bit like, I don't know, maybe like confused when we start talking about like, bypassing and so on. Is this something that you initiate on your own, or is it something that is already happening that you can't really, do anything about? If you're stuck in understanding, you're stuck in understanding. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. But I think my critique of philosophy is this, right? When we start talking about the layman, I don't see the layman doing philosophy, right? The philosophy is always silent. He's doing philosophy, but he's not like the way we're doing philosophy. He's not doing philosophy consciously. So I am always skeptical about this sort of like universalization of philosophy, because religion has always placed a room for the damned, the ignorant, the helpless, these sort of like inevitable conditions that you can't overcome in order to philosophize. So it seems like if we want to talk about some universalization of philosophy, we have to address conditionality. And if we don't address conditionality, then you're telling me that the disabled person can't philosophize, right? So where is there room for, I think my critique of philosophy is there's no saving, right? There's no room for the other person that can't, right? We assume that everybody can, but again, when we start talking even economics, right? Do you have the leisure to philosophize the way, we could sit right here? I think Daniel will give a big talk in economics with me one day about this. But yeah, those are my concerns, really. So yeah, I'll pass it on.
Good to see you all. I'm my first time here. I know a few of you, though. I hope I can come more often, but it will be difficult. It will be difficult with my schedule now. So the whole discussion you had with the Overman reminded me of my trip to Italy in the summer with Thomas O'Halloran. We went to Ivo De Gennaro's house in northern Italy, and we kind of talked about something similar. Now, I have to warn you, the Hegelians might be a little bit offended now. This is now Heideggerian stuff, but basically, the Nietzschean point with the Overman is, okay, we find a source of sense. We have lost God. God is dead. Now we try to find another source of sense. Now it's the human being. The human being is, of course, not ready for this task to become the source of sense, the origin of sense. So Nietzsche becomes mad in accomplishing this task. Now, for Heidegger, the element where really the light comes from, that's also a good, when you don't know, right, when you want to ask the meaning crisis, we always have to ask, where's the light coming from? And what does this element, where the light of intelligibility also is coming from, what does it need? What does it want? What is its what does it necessitate from the human being that is philosophizing? Now, as you may know, Heidegger said that the true light is not the light of reason. So basically, he also said that reason is actually the hardest enemy of thinking. You may know that. So for me, it's then okay. How this was the discussion with Yulich now, like how can we let this free element, which he calls the null, which is from Giacomo Leopardi, or we could say nothingness, how can we let that element sway? And that's also perhaps for me is where I then was so interested in Buddhism. For example, you have the Kyoto school, absolute nothingness, and we learn, for example, also by meditation and by other practices, we learn how to let this strange element sway, so to say, and then it gives the sense to things, the sense to beings, so they can unfold in their suchness or in their selfness, which in Buddhism would then be called tathata. Or thusness, so these are other translations. the thing is, for someone like Heidegger, and for you, now, like what would change is completely how we do philosophy. Because suddenly in metaphysics, we do not have to kind of like justify this one point from which the origin comes from, but we have to kind of like learn how to release ourselves in such a way that this nothingness element can freely sway. And that's then where these other practices that I'm partly developing with Guy, and this was developed by John Vervaeke and Christopher Mastropietro. They think that dialectic into dialogos, also to say this, is one practice where we can cultivate the taste for this nothingness. Because we go, so to say, in this practice, we also enact the movement where the self, so to say, dies and then is resurrected. So a negation and an affirmation. And then we kind of can see that this nothingness is not just a privation, but it's also the element where, let's say, the sense is coming from. So it's in a sense both.
Beautiful, Mr. Zaruba, and thank you for being here, because I know it is not exactly early. Good man, and so I will give it to Miss Samantha Harris and Mr. Ebert. And again, it's so delightful to see all these wonderful people here today. So thank you all for being here. And Miss Harris, thank you for coming by.
Hi, I'm glad I could be here today. I'm still living as a nomad, but I'll get there. Actually, I do want to say before my point, what Daniel Zaruba said about nothingness was absolutely beautiful, because my husband and I are kind of in a point where we're in this nothingness and we have all these possibilities, and it's exciting and dreadful at the same time. So I want to go back to what Zach Fishman was saying about, you said something about relevance realization, and we must select one thing, but then we're boxed in by that thing, and then recognizing guides and acting in particular ways. In recognizing those guides, it kind of gives us those, it gives us like an essence of a feeling, like we all kind of know what that feeling is. And then Javier was talking about the overman, and with the overman, we might all have different interpretations of it, but the essence of it, we kind of understand what we're talking about when we say the overman. And I was writing notes on Kafka the other day, because I'm always writing notes on Kafka. I was like, I have to bring this up because it made me think of this when you said this. So in Letters to Milena, he says this quote, and he says, I am constantly trying to communicate something incommunicable, to explain something inexplicable, to tell about something I only feel in my bones, and which can only be experienced in those bones. And I think he's very right. And what is felt is this essence, and everybody knows the feelings he's talking about, but because of our different experiences, we explain what's being felt differently. And I think the reason why his stories are so surreal, in particular and boxed in, are because those things are very specific to him. But it's those specific things, and those specific things that only he fully understands, that makes it possible to bring about that specific feeling, that specific essence out. Like he by being specific to doing only something that he understands, he's able to capture that feeling. And so by the way he's doing it specifically, then we all can kind of understand that essence. And it's like we don't know how we're doing it, but we just do it. I don't know. That's just what it made me think of.
No, I think that's very good, and then I'll give it to Mr. Ebert and Zach. I think in Kafka we see one, an idea that if we were to be panthers and animals, we would escape the tension of having to think. But then we have where thinking leads us into trying to get to a castle, or trying to get, you could say the castle and the meta question go together. To the pure axis, you can never do it, and the very effort can actually get you more captured. But then what does that mean you do with thinking? And this kind of also points to the question of, are you better off with philosophy or not? What does philosophy do? Does it make the world a better place? Does it not make a better place? If you have philosophy, are you less likely to get tempted to go toward the castle, or more likely to be tempted to go toward the castle? And what philosophers help you with that? Does the philosophy help you achieve the ability to enter into the nothingness that Mr. Zaruba talked about? Or does it take away your capacity to engage in the nothingness that Mr. Zaruba talked about? Oh, and if you engage in the nothingness today, what about if tomorrow you lose it? Right? Like, how does that look like? And then I'll give it to Mr. Ebert, Mr. Fishman, Javier, and then Mr. Barnes. Unless Mr. Barnes, real quick, since we have the mic, you want to speak real quick.
No, I just wanted to raise the question whether, we've got all these philosophical systems, whether we're trying to look for the absolute, whether we're trying to, go for nothingness, whatever end that is, right? But I think Samantha brought up a really interesting point, which is, whether it's the overman, whether it's nothingness, whether it's the absolute, it always feels like philosophical systems in their purity are trying to reach towards something incredibly inhuman. And the particularness which comes out, this is why I would say I've gone on a more anti-philosophical bent, is because I feel like the particularness of what it means to be human and the messy dogmatisms which that entails come out way more in literature than they do in the tomes of philosophy that we've been accustomed with. So again, the only reason I care is because I care about philosophy. So I'm not being completely negative here, but I think it's a valid question. Instead of us trying to idealize this pure thing, is maybe this purity of philosophy, these philosophical highest values, these things we're reaching out for, maybe that's what destroys human beings, basically. Maybe the overman is it's probably like the absence of human beings, right? And in that sense, maybe we shouldn't be thinking purely philosophical. Maybe we should be reaching towards philosophical purity. Maybe we should kind of embrace our dogmatisms a bit more.
No, absolutely. I think it's very interesting to think of the relation of philosophy and literature and different things. Ms. Willem, good to see you. Thank you for coming by. I will now give it to Mr. Ebert, Mr. Fishman, and Javier. I think he has to meet his Buber quota. So we have to give him a chance to bring up Buber. We wouldn't want him to miss out on that. You got a quota. I understand, Javier.
That's awesome. So a lot. There's something about using the sort of heuristic of animals are natural, and the overman will see us as we see animals, but we see animals as natural. So as opposed to the overman seeing us as sort of lesser form, it very well may be that he's a Rousseauian idealist and views us as higher or closer to God than he is. And if we could view ourselves from the position of the overman, as a Rousseauian might view us as more natural than he, because we're dumber, we might be able to take, as you just said, all of our attachments as natural inclinations that are somehow beautiful in their stupidity and in their innate dumbness, and just sort of accept that dance. One thing I wanted to say about nothing, I really believe so strongly that the only nothing it arises from excess. The only absence is caused by excess. And yes, I'm going to bring something physical into this, which is the first law of thermodynamics, but it's just as valuable as any other thought, and it's that you cannot create or destroy energy. The only way to create a nothing, a seeming zero, is to smear, like you have a clean windshield. A bug hits it, you notice it, right? The only way that you can't notice that, the only way to make that bug disappear is to take that bug and smear it evenly across your windshield, because you can't get rid of it. So that sort of infinite self-relation of the bug to the window creates that bug's absence. Otherwise, it's discrete. And so when we think about success, Each success is a death. I've experienced it every time I succeed at something that I instantly, my drive dies. It's this recurring, you know, each peak is actually a plateau. So you have these peaks that are plateaus and these successes that are deaths. And so the real success is the death that you, when you leap from the peak, which is a plateau, you get to the peak, you're like, oh, it's a flat plateau. It's a flat line. And, you know, when you think about the excess of any oscillation, it's a flat line. And so we get this idea that the sublation, the thing that we think we're going for, is going to make us feel dead. But that's what we want simultaneously. It's part of the death drive, right? We want to feel the bliss of no contradictory sort of thought. And so we go for that fully uniform, unified thought, and we realize, oh shit, I'm dead. And when Javier asked, what is it that like creates the self-negation? And by the way, the self-negation from my point of view is the thing that negates that infinite self-relation, the thing that negates the sublation. It's not the thing that creates it. It's the thing that negates your congealed identity. You're like, you know what, fuck this. And that self-repulsion, it's almost like, it's like, how do you get bored? How does that happen? And it's like, how do you say, how do you get bored? You just get bored. You're like, you have a desire, a will to live, a will to power. You have a desire to experience conflict or experience some sort of growth. And that just arises. And I do think, you know, to Javier's point, it's like, you can try and make that happen, but it will also just happen. I think it takes more energy, I think very clearly, to keep consolidated the immortality projects of mankind, to keep the relationship together, you know, or like not let yourself like allow it to self-repulse so that it can grow into a higher form of the same relationship, you know, and those fears that try and keep us in that sublated state end up creating a purely determinate shell without any true infinity inside of it. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
So there's a lot that's been said here. I want to try and respond to a few different things. First of all, Javier, what you said about the overman being an impossibility because it's already within you, like samsara is nirvana, nirvana is samsara. I'm not sure that I buy that move. You know what I mean? Like I'm happy to accept certain paradoxes, but like Buddhism always pisses me off with this because it's like, okay, if nirvana is samsara, then why do the Eightfold Path? And I guess you could say, well, there is no reason, like, you know, all striving is vanity, just be. It's like, okay, but like, I don't know, maybe this is just my Western mind refusing to surrender the ego or whatever. But I guess that's kind of an aside. I don't want to get too distracted in that, but it relates to what we're talking about here, because like the overman, like when I say the overman is a possibility, I mean, because like in order to have a concept, you need examples of that concept in order to abstract the concept from, right? Like we know what a table is, not because we have some sort of definition of table, which can include all tables, but only tables, right? If you ask me, what is a table? I'll say, something flat that you eat off of. It's like, well, okay, this chair is flat and I could eat off of it, but it's not a table, right? So the essence of the table is able to be perceived as an abstraction out of the communion of all the different tables that we see in the world, right? And so to me, the overman, like point to the overman in the world, right? And then we can begin to abstract out the principle of the overman. But I feel like the whole idea of the overman is that it's not yet in the world. And so it becomes this impossibility. Unlike the guide, where like to me, you ask me, what does it mean to be a guide? I can't give you a formulaic definition, but what I can do is I can point to all the people who have acted as a guide in my life, and I can bring them into communion in my mind, and some figures will be more central than others, right? And out of that communion, I can kind of abstract out the principle of the guide, which I can then modify through my imagination, because that pure abstraction is not exactly what I'm striving to be, right? And then in relationship to what Alex Ebert was saying, like the idea that as soon as you have your goal, you lose your identity, I think is so true and so important. But this again, like the guide, ultimately, like what a guide wants is for the person that he is guiding to overcome him and not need his guidance anymore, right? So if I guide you successfully, then you don't need my guidance, at which point I am not a guide anymore. We're partners now. I'm not your guide. And so the goal is death in that sense, but it's the kind of death like, a father wants to die and leave his wealth to his children, right? It does sublate death in that sense. But it's real because I'm able to abstract out the essence from the communion. Whereas with the overman, I don't feel like I'm able to do that, unless you guys can point to various examples of the overman in the world, but I feel like that's kind of defeating the whole point. And so yeah, that's where I would go. That's where
exactly.
I would go.
You're like pointing to something very important about the overman. And I think the important part about it is that it is kind of indeterminate, and the kind of nail in the coffin for me for this, and this is kind of my reading of it, is at the end of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Zarathustra turns around to his followers after all these parabolistic stories, all these things being laid out, and just says, I've told you everything I know, now go your own way. And I feel like the overman, okay, Nietzsche might have had his own specific idea of what that looked like in his head, but I think that the base concept, and I feel like this is the real conclusion from Zarathustra, is that, the overman could take many different forms. And it ultimately, and this comes back to the problem we've been trying to wrestle with a little bit here, is it depends on the values you have in a way. But that's my reading of it, at least.
No, and I will note, and then I'll give it to Javier and to Ruba. There is something very interesting about all of these topics where you talk about reaching some sort of infinity, some sort of final point. There's also a loss. There's this notion that philosophy is everywhere. In your book, you talk about you can have a philosophy of everything. And it's almost like precisely because you can have a philosophy of everything, it seems like philosophy may not matter. And it's like this kind of it's like Mr. Ebert is saying, it's precisely these kind of things that seem to be all encompassing that simultaneously can strike us as as being also nothing, which does suggest that nothing does not maybe mean what we tend to think that it means. It may be more like Mr. Ebert is saying, like if you smeared the bug on the windshield. I think about if I took this bookcase and expanded it infinitely, it wouldn't be a bookcase anymore. It'd be like a monster. It'd be like a kind of nothing. It wouldn't be there. And yet at the same time, the bookcase would be the biggest and greatest of all bookcases. So this is what's kind of interesting that we're talking, like the pinnacle of the overman simultaneously seems to be a defeat, right? It seems to be. The very fact philosophy can be about everything makes it seem like it's arbitrary. So there's this infinite way where indeed excess seems to have something to do with nothing, not being anything, and yet nothing doesn't mean what we think. But I will give it to Javier. Now, Javier, remember, you have to mention Buber 4 times. That's your quota, 4 times. So go.
Okay, Buber. Let's get it. All right. But no, this got me really pumped up. I think Samantha was hitting on something so beautiful, man. I'm so excited. Yeah, Buber. What would Buber say to this? Because Samantha really hit it on the coffin. When we talk about this self-striving, right? Are we trying to know something, or are we trying to be in relation to something that we don't necessarily need access to know? It seems like what Samantha was pointing to was that you can have relationship to something and not know it. And this is what Buber actually argues, where what he calls the living God, that you don't need to know what God is. You just are constantly being thrusted against it. You are in relationship to it. And so even like in my own tangible relationships, right? I meet somebody I don't know, and yet at the same time, I am in relationship to them. I feel in some ways addressed, right? So I think we can go back to this idea of like addressment and explaining, which I think is really important. I really like what Alex Ebert said here about nothingness and access, because it actually reminds me of the Zen koan, and I hope Daniel remembers this. The ride the bull while walking. This is the maxim of the access. It's such an access that it becomes, you can no longer determine what is you and the bull. It is literally you riding the bull while walking. That is like the beauty of like what Nishitani calls nothingness, actually. It's such a nothingness that it's like a wholeness, actually. Or, we want to say like a whole with H-O-L-E, whole. It's such an access in that excess in that sense. Let's see. Oh, yes, the box, being boxed up. I think Zach talked about this, right? Being boxed up. What's interesting about the idea of like escape or like feeling trapped is that as human beings, we have this provocative insight where we can observe the observer, which in my opinion, like animals can't do. They can't observe the observer in the midst of their very reaction, but we can catch ourselves observing the action in the midst of the action as we do it. So it's this awareness that provokes a very interesting idea about being trapped, which in Buddhism, they would say, actually, your very awareness of that trap is actually the very condition that allows you to escape it, right? The very fact that you can acknowledge that you are trapped and aware of that trap. So I thought, I just would share my insights on that. Now, I know, Zach, you have like beef with Buddhism, but keep in mind, Nietzsche took his notion of Buddhism from Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer gets his notion from his own interpretation of Buddhism. So whatever, I mean, I'm kind of guessing here. If Nietzsche's critiquing Buddhism, it sounds like it's Schopenhauer's interpretation of Buddhism, because it seems like when we talk about Buddhism, really the correct term is Buddhisms. And just to kind of like break it down for you, there is like, it's not all like I understand your disagreement about like my saying that there's no like self-striving, but actually there's types of Buddhism that firmly believe in the self-striving. But it's when we start talking about like Mahayana Buddhism and stuff like that, that they're like, no, it's Buddha nature. Everybody has the potential to be enlightened. You're already there, and so on. So when we start talking about like East Asia Buddhism, that's when we start getting the concepts from. But I just want to say, like, when we start talking about Buddhism, it's really Buddhisms, and there's always been disagreements about like this self-striving. Oh, you can't do it. It's impossible to achieve. I think looking at the Overman as a failure is very interesting about like, okay, so if it's a failure, we know it's a failure. So then what are we striving for? We striving for failure, or we striving to become what we already are, which is inevitably a failure because we already are. So that's how I like to pose it. But yeah, I'll pass it on.
Two things real quick, and then I'll get to Zaruba and Ebert. First off, is it Buddhist to defend Buddhism? Javier, you got to tell me that. Second, Emilio, great to see you. Third, maybe Schopenhauer's problem when he looked at that bug on the window and said that all life is that he didn't squash it and smear it. And then he would have been like, there's a lot going on there. So, with Mr. Ebert. So maybe that's what Schopenhauer got wrong. So Mr. Zaruba, please.
Oh, there's a lot, and usually I don't have that every day someone lets me talk about samsara and nirvana and nishitani, so that's very good. There was really a lot there, and I hope I don't forget anything. So the first thing, Zach, when you mentioned the sameness, right, of samsara and nirvana, this is something you can only say at the end of the bodhisattva path. So this is really at the end of the journey. When I just throw this out to you, then this really doesn't have any meaning. This is something that needs to be appropriated, existentialized in your own life. It needs to be taken up. Nishitani has these analogies of the fields. So he has a topological way of thinking about things. First of all, there's the field of egoity, of self-consciousness. And as soon as doubt arises, that collapses and we are thrown into the field of nihility. And through the practice of great doubt, and then we could say other practices, for example, that come more from, let's say, apophatic Christianity, like, for example, releasement in a kind of Eckhartian sense, or these things. This is then the way to come to this last field, which is the field of shunyata, the field of kenosis, right? Self-emptying. And this is also really then an ethical, as a Christian charity, for example. This is also where we can learn from this. Really he quotes, for example, Saint Francis of Assisi as one example where this can be practiced. For Nishitani, what was interesting is the gap between reality and our realization of it. And for him, the essence of religion was the self-realization of reality, which is at the same time, John Vervaeke has also his term relevance realization, comes from this concept from Nishitani, the real self-realization of reality, which is a kind of real appropriation with one's entire being, so mind and body and heart, of reality. So, but this gap, that's so right, that's so present, for example, in Kant, because in Kant we cannot overcome it, and then in Hegel, in Hegelian thinking, it is principally there. This is so interesting for Nishitani, and this is something that meditation and the Bodhisattva path can afford you, to come to this real self-realization of reality, where we are really in contact, let's say, with the world, where the world is world, and to speak Heideggerian time. And then when we have reached, when we've reached the other shore, nirvana, then at this part, then we can go back, such that we can say, this was only advanced by Dogen. This wasn't there before, this sameness of samsara and nirvana. So the step back, then again, those two are actually the same. And other strands of Buddhism don't have that either.
Daniel, talk about the Zen koan. Talk about the Zen koan, Daniel.
Case study and Mr. Ebert's thinking.
Yeah. There was just one thing that Alex, you spoke about the kind of economy, like in thermodynamics, when I read, for example, someone like David Bentley Hart, this economy has been, this doesn't explain existence. This doesn't explain the sheer being there-ness of something. This is kind of like what modern physics kind of like gets completely wrong. I heard a couple of months ago, it's like, oh, formulas tell us this world shouldn't be here, like the universe shouldn't exist. So there's this sheer gratuity, this sheer gift of existence as such, that we cannot kind of explain away. And kind of like the economy, like he, for example, explains this economy, let's say, of life and death and this sacred exchange. That was actually overturned by Jesus Christ during Easter. So these are just some of the thoughts. And again, that this doesn't, we still have the problem of that something is, the sheer thatness of something, the kind of like the isness, the ground of beingness, that kind of thing. And that ontological difference, I think we have to keep in mind.
Science doesn't explain a lot. But I think that the first law of thermodynamics, less the second law, but the first law, lends itself to this idea that which is immanent must be necessarily absent from our sense perception, because that which is immanent, being everything, is non-discrete. And so we cannot pick out any discrete elements or differential elements within that which is immanent. And so God, any God that is immanent, must be apophatic. And that's the point, and that's actually the only point I really wanted to make is that the reason I think we drive to become nothing via excess, the reason we want to have a sublated identity, where we have that moment, is to feel the very same absence within us that we know is the very same excess of the immanence of God, or the immanence of the universe, or whatever it is, to be in resonance for just a moment with the excess that is the absence.
Thank you for explaining that now. Now I get it better. It's very good. Thank you.
You were talking about nothingness, and it made me think of everydayness. And they said, can everydayness become nothingness? Because things in our everyday seem concealed as we forget them. They're still there, just not seen. Kind of like driving to work every day. And we get to work and we're like, how did we get to work? I don't even remember going to work. So that's my question.
And I think it points to, I always like to talk, and Mr. Barnes is here, so I'll bring up David Hume. There seems to be like the state of common life that you're just kind of born into that can feed into what, like the banality of evil or everydayness. And that I started coughing when I started talking. Well, it's really bad. It's like a fly or something. Oh my, I might die. Actually, it'll be terrible. It will be, but I got someone to blame though, so that's great. We can, but anyway, so you have the kind of everydayness that could be a kind of make you susceptible to the banality of evil, thoughtlessness that gets you sucked into totalitarian regimes. So David Hume's like, well, then you need to go on the journey. You go off to philosophy and you kind of learn how to think. But then the temptation there is you stay in philosophy and you kind of see yourself as better than common life, and you become a force of kind of terror. What you need to do is come back and embed yourself in a common life. Now that he is not saying, say, like give up philosophy or to become banal, but he's saying that actually like one needs to gain the philosophical ability to, if we're using Mr. Zaruba's language, or kind of Heideggerian, without that philosophical ability, it's almost like you can't experience the fullness of common life, the suchness, the thisness. It can't really strike you. And so you need to go on that journey. And yet it's kind of weird because it looks like you didn't go anywhere. And this kind of doubleness is what I find very interesting. Like what Mr. Ebert's talking about, the only sense that the word nothing, it would be this kind of excess, this full saturation is where, you know, this infinite saturation is where nothing comes in. And it's kind of interesting because it's like, oh, that's, you know, so common life suddenly, because you go on this journey, has a newness to it. This also suggests that there's a difference between, say, nothingness that equals insignificance, where everything is nothing because it's insignificant. And that would be like the invisible doorknob in Heidegger. But then there's a kind of nothingness that's the apophatic nothingness, where it's like, oh, it's nothing because it's so much greater than my faculties to get that it strikes me as nothing, but that's actually because it accesses what I am capable of. So here's a question for us, because the beginning had a lot to do with the question of, is philosophy worth it? Does it do anything for us, et cetera, so forth. Does philosophy help us experience nothing as apophatic, or does it not help us escape experiencing nothing as Heidegger's doorknob? Is philosophy something that helps us get to the place where nothing is apophatic and it kind of points to a fullness? Or does philosophy actually hurt our ability to experience nothingness in that way? Does philosophy contribute to us experiencing nothingness like that insignificance, where nothing matters and it's arbitrary in the Heideggerian sense? Or does philosophy help us experience a sort of fullness to life? And then the reason that question is important, and then I'll pass it to Mr. Zaruba, I believe, and is then we can ask the question, okay, if we say that philosophy somehow helps us experience nothingness as infinite, as fullness, does that orientation help us deal with technologies like Dall-E? Does that orientation help us not end up in Kafka's Castle, the episode of Black Mirror? Does it help us solve the meta crisis or not? If we say that it does, well, then philosophy is not arbitrary and it's in fact a good thing, right? But if we say that it doesn't, then philosophy doesn't matter, and why bother, and go into that. So I think, to kind of think of it in those terms, but let me give it to Mr. Zaruba.
That's very, very good. That brings us, I think, to the heart of the matter. Because when we go with Heidegger or someone like Eunoia, then the problem is we have, in always establishing, let's say, a ground of being, that itself then became the kind of understood as a being for many traditions, as a kind of super being, but like God, like is this kind of super being that's somewhere perhaps outside of the universe, but kind of like a creator or something. And this is similar. This is Nishitani, for example, rails against this all the time. Kind of like the will to power is still a thing that is a will, but we have to get rid of that kind of metaphysical move that we identify a certain thing, a certain being that is kind of like gives the ground to all other beings. And then philosophy is not really in service to this kind of like, let's say this apophatic movement, where we say, not only we say God is a no-thingness, but we also have to learn how to hold ourselves in such a way that we really kind of, that this really comes across. This also needs to be practiced. This needs to be participated with. This is not just simply something we can propositionally assert, but we have to also act in such a way that this makes sense. And this is then the whole Heideggerian point where he goes back, how do we comport ourselves actually in life? How do we do things? What is this? This is really important, how we do this. Philosophy has to become, let's say, practical again. And this is a similar thing than, let's say, what many philosophers did, let's say, in the trajectory of metaphysics itself. So this really goes at the heart of the matter.
Something I've been thinking about, and Mr. Barnes and I spoke about it last night with Michelle, that it was far too late, but one can only speak after the children fall asleep, and mine don't fall asleep till late. That Mr. Barnes can attest to, actually, is that there's something where we tend to think of like the metaphor that comes to mind when we think about nothing as a black hole. It's kind of the meta question: is a black hole is something that sucks you in and then you're in trouble. But something we came to, and it's like the base of Mr. Barnes' cover, it actually kind of looks like a white hole, a white hole, where it's like it pushes everything out. And it's almost like the meta question pushes out all the sub questions in the same way that it's almost like the nothingness that we're describing is more like a white hole that it kind of pushes everything out of. And if you approach it, though, it can destroy you. Like if you literally try to approach a white hole, it would like destroy you in a different way than, say, like a black hole, where it sucks you in and you get sucked in, where a white hole destroys you because it's so much excess, if I use Mr. Ebert's language, that it obliterates you. And if we think, I'm not an expert on the science, so anything that I say that is scientifically wrong, just smile at me and nod. But if we think of something about the Big Bang as having a white hole function, then you are always already a result of a white hole. You are always already a result of a kind of excess of an infinity that now, if you try to approach, will destroy you. And this is where I think it helps me to think of absolute knowing as kind of a white hole, because there's this weird thing in Hegel where it's both a limit, but simultaneously some kind of fullness that you're always already participating in. And thinking about it kind of metaphorically as a white hole can be kind of helpful. Now, of course, one has to go to the details of that, but that's where you can see how it can be some kind of thing that generates, but also there's a limit. Like a white hole is, you're limited from going because it pushes against you per se, but it also has a generative function. And I would have to discuss that. But Mr. Emilio, it is good to see you, sir. And then I'll give it to Emilio, Dimitri, and Mr. Ebert.
Hello, nice, such lovely conversations. I'm really happy to be here. First, thanks so much for everyone for talking about these things, because like this concept of nothingness is, I think it's the first time I'm hearing it in this type of ways, like a white hole, or in this, or like the nothingness is the excess of everything. I thought that was a really interesting way of thinking it, so thank you. And the only thing I was thinking, not precisely in that vein, but when you asked the question, Daniel, about is philosophy useful? And I mean, you, in almost any case, you can go and argue that the definition of something, right? Like philosophy could be like how to live a good life, or philosophy could be how to do X, or so you can always choose and debate a specific definition. But I think that philosophy is useful in the sense that it gives you lenses, and it's a much broader view than another discipline. Like for example, as you say, Daniel, in the book, that ideas are practically lenses. If you are an engineer, you view everything as with numbers, right? You view equations, you view everything, you view it in that sense. If you're a musician, you see everything as music. So you always have that specific lenses of looking at the world. And philosophy, I think, the beauty is because it's more ambiguous in the sense it allows you to take a step back and say, okay, how can we view the world in this different matter? And I think philosophy is useful. It's useful, and it helps us in that sense, because it gives you these new lenses that then we can apply in the world. So I think that's a particularly well, that's why I thought that was something interesting. And even in these concepts that, for example, you could say like a random person, like, what, I don't care, like nothingness, like as an excess of everything, or as a lack of everything. Like, I don't care about that distinction. Like, philosophy is not useful. Like you could, like, someone could say that, right? But then you say, okay, but it's, well, I don't know how to name this idea, but it's kind of, you explore in some sense, and then it becomes something useful. A particular example, like we went to the moon, right? Like the humans went to the moon, and why? just because it looked fun. But those technologies resulted useful, right? So in this sense, like why would someone care about like nothingness being like an excess of everything? You could say like that's not useful. But then in retrospective, you could see like, oh, that was a building block of this other idea that then became like super useful concept. So I think like for me, or a definition I would argue about is that philosophy is this machine, this way of making new lenses, and I think that's useful. But yeah,
that's a really nice kind of thing. So even like there's something about, even if philosophy has a kind of uselessness to it, there can still be secondary kind of downstream effects. I like that.
Daniel, to your everything you said about Buddhism and Heidegger, it just makes me more interested in them, especially because I'm so fascinated by Hegel as well. So it doesn't offend me. I really yeah, like what you said, for example, by the samsara is nirvana, like this direct equation. It only has any concrete meaning when you really actualize those abstractions and are in the world to live them out. And that's really what Hegel makes you think about. That's it for me. About Heidegger at this point, well, not to say I don't want to talk about Heidegger, but Heidegger's a Nazi. So there's like, I mean, I have to study Heidegger more, but
ad hominem arguments are usually not, you know.
No, it's not. I mean, it's not ad hominem. He is a Nazi. We all disagree with Nazism. I don't want to say it's the evil thing and blah blah blah. But you know, you can be a philosopher and a very bad person, and you know, like, I mean, that's always the question when we're talking about Heidegger. Is like, oh yeah, how much like is Nazism an actual extraction from his philosophy? You know, how does that work? And Emilio, just on what you said about being and nothing, Hegel says pure being is the worst of all abstractions. So you can even take that and continue to philosophize, but I think something like what we're doing here is great, because you enter this room, the net, you have no idea who you're going to meet. It might be whoever, and just to confront yourself with that, to really listen to what the others say, and to allow this spiritual self movement that, you know, we have no idea where the conversation is going next. Like, this is really great about this day and age, and yeah, I feel definitely like something new and radical is emerging from it. Another side, then I will finish, is that I study software engineering. That's really my that's what I do in my daily life. And you know, Bart has this idea about archetypology and stuff, and I think I've even thought about, you know, you could make an archetypology drawing from the shapes of spirit in the phenomenology of spirit, like for example someone in observing reason and whatever. But yeah, it's definitely, like, most of the time it is a certain type of person who does study software engineering, and even more so someone who's really, really good at it. If you look at my school, you know, there's a small amount of people, and they're leading everyone, and everyone else just tries to mimic them. So, you know, like, there is a lot of naivete in the whole tech world, and there's this implicit telos that the better the AI, the more fulfilled our lives would be. It's really extremely naive. You shouldn't underestimate it. And yeah, so definitely interesting to think about the emergence of, you know, communities like us, and then these other things, and how do we, you know, like, have this like intermembranic communication, to talk about like in a kind of Bardian language.
No, and I'll pass it to Mr. Ebert, Javier. And I will note, it would actually seem that basically every single philosophy has the potential. If we follow Mr. Barnes' book, every philosophy seems to have the potential to becoming a force of terror, actually. You know, Heidegger's indeed could be, even if you know, with Nazism, but there's basically, you can go through all the history of philosophy. And that's actually what's kind of interesting, is that any philosophy seems like, if it's not rightly handled, or held or thought about can become a force of destruction, which then maybe suggests we shouldn't bother with philosophy, right? But we've also been suggesting that philosophy may help us actually in some way avoid ending up in a Kafka story, or help us see the nothingness as a kind of creative force, a white hole, absolutely knowing these things seem to be good, right? So there's something very interesting here about philosophy and being unbound, which precisely can make it problematic, but also because it's unbound, that's precisely why it could be good. And so it's interesting to approach that. And I think Mr. Barnes' book captures that well, but I'll give it to Mr. Ebert and Javier.
But your question at the end, does philosophy lead us more to this nothingness and accessing the concept of the dual nature of excess and absence? And I'll just speak personally. I struggle, and this is my own self-relating negativity here. I really struggle with the contradiction between the set of ethics I brought into philosophy and my realizations upon doing philosophy. And largely because, and I'll add to that there seems to be a milieu of the status of the philosopher, such that the higher minded the philosopher, the more inclined to view all developments across humanity as things to be reconciled with, as opposed to things to refuse, to view all things as the natural mechanics of the development of history. And as such, we end up relegating ourselves to the armchair. And part of being a great philosopher is sort of moving yourself to the witness state. There is sort of a Buddhist sort of witness stating of the self in order to really analyze in sort of objective terms, or as objective as you can be, the full mechanics of the movement of life. But by relegating ourselves to that witness state, we also sort of become these passive actors, and that passivity becomes an integral feature of the philosophy, such that you really end up, if you're going to be an activist philosopher, the only thing I can really think of is accelerationism. I'm like, okay, we'll just make the process happen faster. Accept all of it, reconcile with all of it. So when I think about Dall-E, my initial impulse with my ethics that I bring in as an artist are fuck Dall-E. I think all that art is garbage, for real. I hate that shit. I shit on all of that. I shit on it. I hate it. It's pop. It's sheen. I just want to destroy it. But then as a philosopher, I'm like, yeah, but where's it going? And what's that fear that I have? Why am I afraid of this pop sheen thing? Why not, like, what's on the other side of it? Why am I afraid of this singularity that might occur between me and the AI? And so I have to engage with that, and I have to consider that and consider my own fears around that. And then all of a sudden I'm this fucking accelerationist, and I'm looking around like, whatever happened to my ethics? So I have this real internal contradiction, and it's something I think about every goddamn day, and yeah, and it's unresolved at the moment.
For me, if a case cannot be made that philosophy helps with the issue of Dall-E, then how can one make a case that Dall-E helps with the meta crisis in general, right? That's where, like, what Cheetan was saying last time about like a particular case study. And what exactly is our approach to, say, the Dall-E? Is it inevitable and we just kind of roll over and say it's going to happen because the owl of Nineveh has flown? Do we sort of gain the ability to interpret of, say, it is interesting to think of Nick Land in this context. Mr. Barnes we were actually talking about Nick Land the other day. So I think that's magnificent, but I will pass it on to Javier and then I'll give it to Mr. Barnes. So Mr. Ebert, thank you.
You know, Daniel, I'm still haunted by Cheetan's insight when he said, well, you know, we have to be careful because the promotion of the question is also what feeds the problem. you know. So that's what I'm like very scared about when we keep talking about like meta crisis, Dall-E. It's very haunting when he said that to me. It really ruined a lot, gave me a lot of nightmares. But yeah, so philosophy, right? I think Nishitani makes an interesting argument, Daniel, as Ruba, if you can like help me remember. I want to say Nishitani actually says, like, you know, when we start talking about philosophy and religion, it seems like for the East, philosophy was religion, religion was philosophy. Like these things were like never such departmental affairs, you know. It seems like when we get into the West, it's like, yeah, there's religion and then there's philosophy. But what's interesting about that separation, and I think Nishitani acknowledges this, is that once you separate philosophy from religion, then you get this really like beautiful perception where it's like you get the view from nowhere, right? You get that advantage point to see everything, right? But when you compare other people's definition of religion, it's because they seek relationship in close contact, right? But then when I think about philosophy, why do we do this zooming out? And I think we do the zooming out to do the exact same thing that religion aims for, which is that intimate contact with reality that we're so talking about. So I think this zooming in, zooming out, I mean, it's definitely necessary for sure. But the third aspect, which is what I think Ebert was getting at, is this awareness, right? We can be thinking, of course, all thinking. I think Barb made this argument, right? Like there's no physics of philosophy. There's always philosophy of physics and everything like that. But the one thing that's interesting is that we are also aware that we're thinking as we're thinking, right? So Buddhism's argument is that if you're not practicing that awareness of thinking, then you fall into wrong thinking, right? And that's the danger. I'm not trying to like push Buddhism on all of you, but I'm just trying to emphasize the fact that philosophy is useful and is definitely central, but at the same time, how do we determine that we're thinking wrongly in the midst of thinking, right? If we're always thinking, if we're always speculating, right? So that's like a really big problem that we get presented with. But yeah, I'll pass it on.
This points to the idea of, are we better off to know about the meta question following Mr. Barnes' work? You know, are we better to know about the ability of thinking about thinking, or would we be better out not to know about it? And that is $1 million question, because what Tidan is saying, like, there's a way in which in Hegel, because I have to get my Hegel quota like you have your Buber quota, is that there is the movement of history. There is, as Dr. Nicholas will talk about, there's an unavoidable making of the implicit explicit, the arising of a new logic that one has to come to terms with in order to meet the development of history, this historic moment. And there's a way here's the question. Is the awareness of the meta question, or the awareness of awareness, which we can just say philosophy, is philosophy an example of a logic that had arisen in history that is required to deal with the historic moment? Or is the arising of the meta question an accident that actually is a threat to the development of history? You know, which direction does one take that? And with that, Mr. Barnes.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of...
He wanted to roast Buddhism, actually. No, Mr. Barnes.
No, I'm going to resist the urge to do it, because I have to hang out with Javier still. Yeah, so I think these sorts of discussions are great. And we live at a time where we're incredibly lucky to have these technologies, because, you know, all of us here definitely have the inclination. I would dare say some of us have the ability to think philosophically, right? But I kind of wanted to give something for us to take away from this, because, you know, like I said, we've got this wonderful thing that unites us, which is the willingness to think. We're all addressing, like, I can't even imagine the amount of thinkers and books that were referenced today. Like,
yeah,
you have to be incredibly well read to even understand, follow the conversation.
I counted 4.
I don't follow half of it, so it just says more about me than anyone else. But I think Dimitri raised a really good point, is that, and this is kind of, again, this is kind of an anti-philosophic thing, is, you know, we shouldn't just assume it as an inherent good. And that's not to say that we shouldn't engage with it. But you can be a very famous philosopher, but be a terrible person.
Sure.
And, you know, despite the fact that we've, you know, had some really, you know, we've got loads of questions to go away, loads of things to think about here. I want to paraphrase David Hume here. And he says kind of, you know, despite your philosophy, still be a man. So I kind of want to challenge everyone here. You know, we've all had a great discussion. We've all got some great things to go away and think about. But, you know, put your philosophic lens down for a bit and just go and engage with nature, go for a walk, spend some time with loved ones today. You know, that's what I would challenge everyone to do.
I feel one. By the way, guys, and then I'll pass it to Harris, and then Pei, please speak. Your mic sounded great at the beginning. There was no problem at all, and you're a beautiful soul. And then I am happy to actually, if anyone wants to speak about Dall-E and that technology for a minute, because the question that would be asked, let's assume that you take philosophy, but you also are a man, that you don't make that mistake. Are you better, or would you just be better off if you were a man?
It depends.
It depends,
right? Philosophy can put you in two different places. You can be in a way truer to yourself. You can reach enlightenment, whatever that means to us, whether that's enlightenment in the Buddhist sense, whether that's the absolute, whether that's the overman. But you can also be Lucifer and Milton, right?
Sure.
Evil be thou my good.
Sure. You get the nice literary reference, actually, and then I'll give it to Mr. So, assuming you are embodied, if you are embodied philosophy, does that help you deal with Dall-E technology or not? See, because if we say not, then why would we think this has anything to help with the meta crisis? If we say yes, then maybe it would. But let me give it to Sam, Pei, and then Emilio.
Oh, I just wanted to say quickly, I do have to leave soon because I have to put my kid down for a nap. But I just really want to thank you, Daniel, especially for putting something like this together, because even though we're all individuals, we all have our certain ways of thinking based on how we've lived our lives and what we've experienced. I think it's so beautiful that we've come together, and there's this essence of something that we're all trying to reach here together. And I just I know I'm getting sentimental, and I always get like over emotional, but it just makes me so happy because this type of thing is so beautiful, and I want to see this type of thing more in the world. So thank you for putting this together. And I hope I can come back soon.
Well, you are
I don't know
soul.
when, but
well, you are a beautiful soul. That's very kind of you to say. Sam Harris is doing exactly what Samuel Barnes just said to do. So well done, man. He's embodying going to the world. So perfectly done. So that was very, thank you, Sam. I appreciate him. And Pei, please go right ahead, and I'll give it to Emilio. And then any thoughts on this question of Dall-E? Sam, always a pleasure to see you. Thank you for everything that you do.
Well, I was just gonna say I had something to say with Zeruba was saying about I'd have to hear his comments again, but it felt very in line with Chris Heidegger's notion of design as care and all, and I wasn't sure if that's where he was heading with that or not, but in either case, I thought it would go fit well with that. But to comment though on I just learned about this week. So I with the whole AI thing. What is it? What was it called? The Dall-E?
So you know, Pei, how you've always wanted to imagine what a pig looked like riding a bat? Well, what you do is you go to this program and you say bat pig riding bat, and it sends you a painting back that shows you that. And you don't have to do anything. You just sit back and consume. So it's like an AI generated technology that's grand.
Yeah, I think how I feel on all that is what's already expressed by Alex. I think that is. I think that there's. I got my certificate in photography many years ago, and part of the reason I just completely dropped it is because Photoshop was coming in and kind of taking away a lot of what I had learned through the art, and I kind of had the similar feelings toward that. I think differentiating between creating something and replicating something, it would be very important in the discussion. And I don't know, maybe everything I have to say on this has already been discussed. Like I said, I'm very new to how far this is all developed, and I think it's far more than what I would have expected, judging by what you just said there.
That's actually really funny because I worked as a photographer for a long time, and it was the same time. I forget where all the Photoshop and everything came, and I was like, oh, this kind of sucks, because I used to do weddings. You could do black and white, and it was like an art, and then it was all Photoshop, and they wanted the red rose and black and white. So it's interesting. So then I'll give it to Emilio. The ability to recognize the distinction between, say, creation or like replication, or the difference between AI and, say, craft in philosophy, if that itself is a philosophical distinction, Are we better off to know that philosophical distinction, or would it just be better off not to know it and enjoy the pig, the pig sitting on the bat, right? If we say we're better off to know the distinction, that would suggest that philosophy has some sort of good to it. If we say it doesn't matter, then it would not matter. So it's interesting to think of that.
Yeah, just quickly on it would be it would essentially is the understanding of art then taken from the creator or the one that's perceiving it? Because at this point it would be, well, if AI can do something that produces the aesthetic of someone that created it, then from that who is interpreting the image, what then is, it would be the difference there. I mean, I guess there would be a whole separate thing on itself, but
it can even bring up Walter Benjamin's aura and different things like that. So first, Javier was attacked by his cat, so he left and came back. And I will pass it. And no, I did not actually make an image of a pig on a bat. That was a random example. I promise, don't look at my laptop. So Emilio and then Mr. Fishman.
So, okay. No. Oh, is it his turn? Is it my turn? I don't even know. Is it my turn?
We don't want to hear about Buddhism right now. We want to hear from Emilio.
Yeah.
Okay?
No. Don't worry. I'm not talking
Turn
about
off your
it.
mic.
Don't worry.
Thank you. I think those, like, for example, okay, so first, the way I think about philosophy, as I said, is like, is philosophy good or bad? So many metaphors, but the one I thought about is that philosophy is kind of like a chef, and you make tools, right? And these tools are, for example, called mental models, or like glasses from which you view the world. And the tool it's neutral. Like, well, it depends, right? Because you could say like each technology has its own ideology within it. So we could go through that type of thought. But again, if you think tools are neutral, then you say like, oh, philosophy just makes the tools, and then you can be a famous philosopher that uses that tools to oppress people, or you can be a good philosopher and like and make a good impact in the world. So you could say like philosophy just makes the tools, and then the person is the one responsible for using the tools in an interesting, useful way. That's a way I can think about it. That I don't know if that's useful. And also, sorry that I'm moving, is that I'm in school and I'm trying this thing that I'm on a piece of grass. I just thought it would be nice, but the sun's moving, so the sun's coming, so I constantly move. And also specifically about the Wall-E thing, I think it's really interesting, and I think that philosophy is useful in this sense. For example, the way the technology works, right, is that it's been fed like all the images possible. So the technology understands what like a cat is, what a building is. So you could say like a building in the shape of a cat, and it gives you an approximation of those two concepts, right? So, but the thing is that the machine can only, as far as my understanding goes, the machine can only produce something with the things of the past, right? It cannot create something new per se. It can only recombine. So, like the styles of painting we've had, like the ideas, the images we've had, it's almost as if it would amber our culture forever. Because if, for example, there are no new creative artists that make new images, because it's so easy to, Wall-E is so easy to use, and every time I want a picture, I just say like, beautiful picture for a philosophy book, right? And it gives me one, and that's enough. Then we become trapped in this. Yeah, it just freezes the culture to the things we have developed so far. And that's a question about the technology itself. But the interesting thing here is that we are philosophizing, right? We are actually thinking if this technology, like the impacts it has, and if it's going to be useful or not. And you could say that's like philosophy. So you could say like, okay, it is useful, because if we just run through the motions, we could end up in a world that maybe has no new art, has no new, no magic in it, to use a simple word. So I think like that's specifically with Wally. That would be a concern, and how does someone arrive at that concern, like by this reflection and doing this type of philosophy. So I think in that way, I think it's useful, right? Because yeah, and you can ask questions that lead to type of philosophy, type of debates that maybe are not as useful. For example, you could say like, oh, is it okay to enjoy the images that Wally made because they are not made by a human, right? Or is it ethical, or like those are interesting questions that may or not be like falsifiable. Or so you could say like, is it a real picture because that specific image has never been created before, but it's been created of stuff before. So you could ask all these questions and philosophize about those, and you could argue the validity or usefulness of those. But there's, at least I think there are at least some specific question of or philosophy or philosophizing that you can do that is more clearly useful or helpful. Yeah, and then there was I recently read like Wally thing to use for something that rustled a lot of people of religion, but I think that's another idea, so I won't go to it right now. But yeah, I think that's the things I would think. And Daniel, could you please remind me, what do you mean with the meta crisis? Because like I sometimes, yeah, I would just like to, I cannot place it into words right now when I think it, so I would appreciate that. And yeah, so that's the two thoughts I have.
So first off, thank you, Emilio. I'm going to pass it. Mr. Fishman said Javier could go before him, but he can't. So Mr. Fishman's going next, then Javier, and then Mr. Ebert. The meta crisis is when I wake up in the morning to go get my cup of coffee, but I am so terrified by the existence of global warming, AI technology, the fragility of complexity systems that I can't drink my coffee. And I am so overwhelmed by the total sum of everything going down that I get in a little ball and I curl up and I go and find some Game B videos to feel better. So that is what the meta crisis would be, the sum total of all of those different crises together, of which then like, let's say global warming, the AI technology, like, and the interrelation between them. Like, how does the technology affect global warming, and how global warming affect the technology, and how does it affect political structures and, you know, the growing globalization and nukes. You can add nukes in there. Why not? I mean, it's like sugar to your coffee, just add some nukes. So it's a similar thing. So the meta crisis is the sum of all of those, which then a lot of the emphasis of, say, Daniel Schleiermacher, different people like that, is that all of those result from a way of thinking. So if you address that way of thinking, that will deal with the game theory dynamics that lead you into all of those different problems. So it's going to be like the meta. It's not just the crisis, but the meta dimension of which generates those crises. And I think also functions as a basket term for all of those crises together. That's how I use it. That's how I understand it. So you know, when we talk about like, does philosophy help with the meta crisis? You know, I would take someone like Daniel Schleiermacher, and I would take someone, you know, I like to think philosophy helps with it, but I'm biased because I do philosophy and I want to sleep at night and feel good about my life choices. But there is something there that seems to suggest that it's so. But then the question, of course, then is the fine distinctions of what kind of philosophy, how, because philosophy also seems to be very dangerous precisely because it leads people into like extreme political movements. You know, we mentioned Heidegger with fashion, but you can go to Rousseau leading to the French Revolution. I mean, we can play this game all day long, right? And so there's something dangerous there. And then, of course, philosophers can be misinterpreted in service of different things, right? So, but, you know, if we think that thinking has something to do with the meta crisis, it would seem like you have to generate. But on that, I'll give to Mr. Fishman, Javier, and then Mr. Ebert.
Okay, so first of all, on this question of like, is philosophy useful? I certainly hope so. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know what else we're doing here if not. You know, I mean, I do think you've all raised the sort of the dangers of getting fixated on a particular philosophy. I think, like, if you don't put your philosophy to the test, if you don't see if it actually works in the world, and if there's no mechanism for which you can test your philosophy in the world and say, okay, this works, but this doesn't, then you're in real trouble. You know, I mean, I think that philosophy needs to be tested in action and then adjusted based on the results of that action. So I guess that's what I'd say about that. When it comes to, I want to say a couple of things about Wall-E, or Dall-E, not Wall-E. That's the robot movie.
Yeah, the robot that in the Disney film that's like destroying us all with energy.
Related. Yeah. So the first thing that's interesting to me is that I went over to a friend's house a while back, and he had just downloaded this app and he's playing with it. And he goes, look at the images that I made. And I went, you made? Like, okay, there is an interesting complexity here of agency, right? Like, where is the source of this coming from? And he's like, well, I gave it the prompts. And it's like, okay, you know. And so I think there's an important question of agency that we need to ask here. And like, is our technology acting as a tool for us, or are we acting as a tool for our technology? Is an important question to raise. And then there's like, to me, I think with all of these technologies, like it brings up the question of like MIDI and like sampling in music, right? Like that when MIDI technology, when you can just play something on a piano sloppily and then press one button and it quantizes it so it's exactly on the beat. It's like, well, I just trained for 20 years to try and play the piano exactly on beat, and so that's gone, you know what I mean? But of course, MIDI opens up this whole new sort of like way of approaching music. And so I think that like if I were to put a positive spin on Dall-E, I would say that it perhaps will initiate a return to the connection between image and meaning, right? I feel like for the last few hundred years, we've kind of said that like a painting is valuable because of the sort of aesthetic beauty of it, because of the sort of difficulty to produce, all these things. It's like the image itself is what makes it meaningful. Whereas I feel like in the ancient world, it was much more like this image is meaningful because it's related to our story, because it has a history, because of other things besides the physical properties of the image, right? Like you could think about like, if I say this is Jimi Hendrix guitar, it's worth millions of dollars. But then as soon as you find out that it's a counterfeit that is molecule for molecule the same, suddenly it's worthless, right? So it shows that meaning is not necessarily held in the physical properties of the object. The care and effort that the artist puts into it also imbues it with meaning. And so I think that perhaps Dall-E will facilitate sort of a return to that way of thinking, would be how I'd put a positive spin on it. But those are my thoughts on it.
Let's frame a question. I'm going to get to Javier and Mr. Ebert. Let's imagine you exist in a world where every human being read Ontological Design by Daniel Frege, which Pei was mentioning in the comments, and Mr. Frege is great. Would that world have a higher likelihood of using Dall-E in the way you just suggested, Mr. Fishman, or would it not make a difference? Or would it be better to have a world where nobody read Ontological Design by Daniel Frege and the technology of Dall-E came and people were using it? If we in our head would posit that it would be better for everyone to have read a book like Ontological Design and then use Dall-E, well, then again, this would suggest that the spreading of philosophy would be a good thing, but it goes back to the beginning of our conversation where it seems like, you know, there's a kind of exclusivity to philosophy, right? But if we can say that somehow everyone reading Ontological Design would actually increase the likelihood that Dall-E is used in a good way, then it would seem as if there would be reason to try to do that per se. There would be reason to try to bring that about, as opposed to just saying, we can't do it, and going off into our like Benedict option from a Rob Drew, or kind of going off to our, you know, leaving it behind, right? Or, well, that's actually an interesting question, and I won't go into it because I'll pass it on. If indeed we conclude the world would be better off to handle Dall-E if everyone read a book like Daniel Frege, which I'm using as a symbol for philosophy in general, are we then morally obligated to try to do that because we know that? Is there a kind of ethical imperative for people like us to try to do that or not? But then, of course, that's dangerous because people have used ethics to control, right? You know, people have used that beyond good and evil, you know, and all that with Nietzsche. So that's a thought I'll have to think about. Let me give it to Javier so we can hear about Buddhism.
I'm actually going to bring up Hinduism in this talk right now.
We pressured him. It's inauthentic. Yeah. He really wants to talk about Buddhism.
But, you know, I think when we raise up the questions and concerns about Dall-E, I think Chetan ruined me when he said, when we talk about technology isn't anything fundamentally different. The different thing that happens is the speed. The speed is what is fundamentally so, I guess, like hard for us to keep up with when we talk about technology and stuff itself. But I think if we're going to talk about Dall-E, we need to talk about why is it a concern, and we have to reapproach art again about what is art, what is art in relation to us that makes Dall-E a concern. You know what I mean? Because when we talk about art, right, I think the superficial take of it is, and I think this is like the general population views when they make something that it's theirs, right? So it's a question of agency, like Zach kind of raised. The thing about the art that I'm sort of looking at it as is that why does when somebody makes something have something more tangible that we can't explain in comparison to an AI drawn thing? My answer is a very boober answer, sorry, to where it's because there is a presence in that very art itself when the artist was making it. If we say Dall-E is making it, right, there is no presence. It feels like a fucking void. Like there is no presence in that thing at all. There is no relation to that thing, right? I just simply told it what to do and it made it. So that's like my primary problem if we're going to talk about Dall-E is we have to approach, again, what do we mean by art? What is our relationship to art? If we can define that, then we can approach the Dall-E problem more in a coherent fashion. But to go back to philosophy, because I know Daniel's gonna bring this up, damn it. He's gonna bring this up. My problem with philosophy is that it seems like every other I don't know, just any other category seems to have a multiplicity of paths, right? I feel like philosophy is kind of like the path of the sages, or like in Hinduism, it would call the path of wisdom, right? It's the path of wisdom. But the thing is, Hinduism allows for other paths to sort of be taken, like the path of devotion and so on, and the path of works to get to the, the truth, right? So I think that philosophy is useful for the Dall-E question, but I don't think it's the only path to handling that question. And it goes back to what I had said earlier, right? You don't need to necessarily know to have a proper relationship with the thing itself, which would be like the acts of devotion that sort of religion always stresses on, right? But I think if we're just talking about philosophy, I think it can help. But of course, I think you guys are all asking the right questions when we, talk about philosophy. So yeah, I'll pass it on.
All right, I think I finally came to something. So I'm a musician. A couple of facts that I thought were really astounding that I learned a few years ago. For instance, this was a stat about 4 years ago. The top 10 most played songs on terrestrial radio of all time had been all made within the last 10 years. So if you can grok that, the top 10 songs ever played on terrestrial radio had all come out in the previous 10 years. So Elvis, the Beatles, wiped out by fucking DaBaby. And on top of that, you have these sound packages. I've worked with I'll tell a story of Avicii, right? I'm working with Avicii. I'm like, that's a great kick. He's like, it took me forever to find it. What that meant was he uses that kick on every single song. And when he died and his fans wanted me to reproduce a few songs that hadn't come out, they sent me the Avicii sound pack. They're like, here, use the Avicii sound pack. Now the Avicii sound pack is being used by all of them. And what I'm saying is, no matter you think, oh, that's a different song, the sounds are exactly the same. And not just for one artist, across artists. We're getting to a place where we're probably on the radio hear 10 types of snare total. Not only that, the snare is not being recorded live. It's got the same velocity every time it strikes. You're hearing the precisely same sounding snare and same sounding kick and gridded, as you noted, on a tempo map, right? So it's completely quantized. Anyway, so you start to get through this democratization, through the implementation of technology into art, a homogenization. And what it starts, and the fear for me, and I think the fear for all of us, and I think the fear for philosophy, is that we start to sense, I'm starting to sense, that depth, psychological and spiritual depth, is actually a scaffolding on top of a fundamental shallowness. That these technologies are proven that there are synaptic shortcuts to enjoyment that can negate the scaffolding. And all the depth in art and all the things we love about art are being able to be negated and shortcut. When I see my daughter really enjoy like a very shitty, homogenized pop song, but I see how much enjoyment, I mean, she's in like a synthomic bliss listening to fucking some random, you know, bullshit. And I have to confront my own sort of judgment. Be like, look at how happy she is. There's obviously some shortcut there. I mean, she'll enjoy really like cool songs too, but I have to sort of confront this idea that philosophy is depth scaffolding. And when we see something like Dall-E, we see our whole purpose, I do, in some sense, being negated. And, you know, anyway, and let's see. Yeah, so philosophy is sort of this problem, and I wrote a few notes down, problematizing of nothingness and being and manifesting these heights all on top of depth, on top of a fundamental shallowness with which to construct a deeper sense of self, a deeper sense of experience. But the success of Dall-E and MIDI proves that there are synaptic shortcuts to enjoyment. I said all this shit. Anyway, that's about what I got there. Yeah.
That's excellent, Mr. Barnes.
Yeah, those are really good points, actually. Just to kind of give you the contrast, possibly a little bit of a white pill on this. It does negate our purpose if you're looking at it in a blank utilitarian sense. Something really important about Dall-E is the lack of intentionality. You're ignoring intentionality. And one very specific example, I think it was Microsoft who did this. They sort of took all the Rembrandt paintings and trained an AI, and they sort of generated a Rembrandt painting. It's sort of like, you know, because the average Rembrandt painting is a portrait of a middle-aged man who's of a certain wealth, and they did all that sort of stuff. And that's technically a really impressive thing. But I wouldn't go physically to a gallery to see the AI generated Rembrandt painting. I want to know the technology behind that. I want to know the engineering behind that. But the intentionality to know that Rembrandt 500 years ago was actually painting them is way more important than if an AI just printed a new Rembrandt painting out. I think that's one way that we can get out of that problem, basically.
Well, this is fact, and then I'll pass it on to Dimitri. So a few things. One, Mr. Ebert is pointing at a question, and the question is the following: is happiness the highest value? If you, as a philosopher, say the point of life is not necessarily, if you say, is happiness the highest value, that itself is a philosophical kind of inquiry, right? Are you better to ask that, or would it be better never to ask that and just accept that happiness is the point of life and enjoy those synaptic shortcuts and so on and so forth, right? But of course, if happiness is the highest value, then you could easily be, you know, or, you know, Huxley sort of Brave New World sort of thing, right? And that could be kind of problematic. The other thing that I think is important when we ask the question, like to Javier, well, I wanted to ask you, well, let's ask this then. Imagine you have like a John Seal kind of Chinese room, and the paintings that came out of it, you didn't know if they were AI generated or if they were human generated, right? Would something be lost that would be consequential? Like, let's say you were in a gallery and they were all AI generated, and you did not know that where you were AI generated. Would something be lost that you would not known that was lost that would be consequential because it was lost? Do you see what I'm asking? Because if you say no, well, then the name of the game is just to make sure we don't know which paintings come from Dall-E and which don't, right? And that's going to take care of things, right? But if we say something is lost, then this could be a big problem. And then I'll point this into Javier's point. Why this might be consequential on the very nature of art. In my opinion, art influences the truth we assent to that then organizes our rationality. And I think a good book on this is the very end. There was a book on Hannah More, who was a abolitionist in the United Kingdom. She was a big deal. She almost actually married the guy who did the dictionary, and I escape it. But anyway, at the end of this book, you know, said that the reason why the efforts of abolitionism failed is because they tried to do it in terms of rationality and argument. And when she says that it's imagination that moves the world. And so she really focused on the arts, and that arts actually cultivated a different kind of truth of which then organized organized how people thought, and it transformed the movement and the abolitionist movement, right? And so for Hannah More, the way that you say bring about changes like that has a lot to do with art, okay? Because art incubates the condition and then organizes your rationality. And art seems to use your language, have something to do with the meta question, where you can kind of escape the dogmatism of sub-questions and start moving toward the meta question. All right, well, if art indeed has something to do, and I'll give it to Mr. Ebert because I see Mr. Ebert.
I just want to rephrase the question that I think the way I'd want to say it in maybe the most potent form is the question has philosophy pretended or willfully ignored that the supposed depth that it has supposed is extant, that it is exploring and uncovering and peeling these layers, is actually a scaffolding that philosophy itself built.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
To then look back down upon itself as a problem to sort of excavate. And so are we problematizing as I think Barnes and
yes.
as I think, definitely Wittgenstein and others are like, we're creating these problems so that we can be like, look, a problem.
Yes.
And actually, yeah.
I would just say to that, and then I'll get to Dimitri, there is definitely some strain, and maybe even the majority of philosophy that is that. The question is, must philosophy be that? Or is there a kind of philosophy that doesn't need to do that? There may be something more like the tools that Emilio was talking about, or the ability to avoid being ontologically designed to, say, fight back, like Daniel Frege talks about. And how is that different in character than philosophy that simply it's its own scaffolding that looks back and then answers itself, that Wittgenstein or someone is deconstructing?
But if we're so simple, if Wall-E and these other things, like for instance, I'm sure you on your email, on your Gmail, you get these prompts to respond to people with preconceived sentences, right? Well, and Jim Rutt responded to a number of responses recently with an AI assistant. The Wall-E thing could very easily extend itself to philosophy itself,
yes,
to book writing itself, right?
Yes.
And you say, I wrote the book, but you gave a few inputs, the AI writes the book.
That's right.
And what that will do, the algorithm that will blend up coming out of that is an analytical comparison of the output of the AI and then the sales of that book. And that will continue to work through itself until the output of the AI has optimized for sales. And what you'll end up with is the exact same problem of reduction of quality or of depth to Wall-E or to pop music or to whatever else the case is. And anyway, that's what I'm sort of saying, is that in the context of Wall-E and in the context of seeing that when this technology becomes available, we seem to have a synaptic shortcut or a reduction to shallowness that I don't know any like that's the sort of problem I'm trying to pose.
Very, very good points. Before all of this, I wanted to, who was that? Was it Samantha? She talked about Kafka and kind of the condition of impossibility. That's also the condition of possibility for expressing the essence. You have appearance and essence, and always when you speak some feeling, there's something lost in the very speaking of it. And in Hegel's philosophy of aesthetics, he kind of builds up art. So first you have like statues or something, or architecture, and it's very abstract. But then like the last, and like I don't know if it was like highest art, I read it years ago, but anyway, he ends with poetry, because poetry is the most alienated art, because you can see that spit operating. I can never really know what the poet wanted to express there, except if you do this Kafka thing, where you use that very impossibility. And like, how many people don't read poetry anymore? Like, that's like Ebert, what you just told me about your daughter, like that's catharsis, right? That's the whole point of it. You're like using the machine for your own ecstatic catharsis. And of course, then you get this homogenization of art. whether in poetry, it's extremely singular, you know, every poem is very singular. And so like, yeah, I you know, I do think that, you know, in 10 years time, is gonna, we have to go beyond this thing of like asking the question, oh, is it made by a human or by a machine, you know, like that's not really like Fraga basically talks about in his book, like we're already in the feedback loop of creation. And I think it's also a great way to critique this whole idea of citations in philosophy books. Like I kind of agree with Bart there that, you know, like why make citations? Like you talk with people all the time, you take up other people's ideas. So the same is happening kind of with machine on this higher order. But Alex, I know you're very critical of Bart on this whole idea about informationalism, but there is really a class divide emerging here, you know, like with all the people who, you know, only use technology for this kind of homogenic catharsis, or people who make themselves even more singular and start going into these autocults, to allude to Frege again.
I think Alex Eber, you asked a really good question about like, is philosophy just a scaffolding that sits on top of our sort of base, I don't want to say impulses, but sort of like we live at this level of just, ooh, sugar over there and ooh, pop song over there. And yet we develop these philosophies of high art and, you know, ultimate purpose and all this thing. And is it sort of just a way to kid ourselves into believing that we're not as shallow and base as we actually are? And I think that this just returns to the necessity of bringing philosophy into physical, like acting upon your philosophy and seeing if it works, right? Because like if you have a philosophy of high art that doesn't allow you to create high art, or to, I mean, maybe you're not trying to create it, but to make people interested in it, like if it doesn't somehow connect to the physical reality, then I think it is just a scaffolding to distract us from the shallowness of our lives. But there's also a certain, like, as soon as you make any sort of philosophy, you're immediately removing yourself, like you're creating this tension where it's like, well, I recognize, like even to say this music is shallow is to propose a philosophy of depth, right? And so just to make that distinction is to create a tension in yourself where you recognize, yes, this is shallow, but there is such a thing as depth, and I aspire towards it mentally, but I'm not embodying it physically, and existential tension, right? And I do think that like we need to live in that existential tension, but I think that if there's no movement between that, if we're not able to adjust our sort of projections of the ideal in accordance with reality, and we're not able to move reality in accordance with our projections, then the whole thing is just a waste of time. So I would, that's what I'd say about that. And then I just wanted to comment briefly on what Daniel said about like, if you're in a room of art created by an AI and you don't know whether it's an AI or not, then like, is something lost? And it seems to me that what's lost is that like, if you go to a museum with some friends of a great artist, then when you leave the museum, you can talk about that art, what they were doing, like historical, philosophical connections to the artist that is not there in an AI. Like if we went to a museum that was created by an AI, we'd be asking ourselves completely different questions, right? We'd be asking a lot of the same questions we're asking today. And so I think that the story in which that object is embedded does have real value and real, like it's a historical force, you know what I mean? Like we will live our lives differently if we believe that this art was created as part of this person's personal story as opposed to an AI. So I think that, yes, I think it does matter. And I think for exactly that reason, that it's the context around it that really gives it meaning. Because otherwise it's just all you're going to the museum for is sort of this dopamine rush of like, ooh, pretty picture. And that's it. You know what I mean? If there's no context, if there's no connection to anything else. So that's what I said.
The very knowledge that there is a story somehow enhances the thing that is there, and yet the story is absent, right? The story is not there in the painting, and yet it somehow enhances the experience of the painting. And I may have froze, I can't tell. This is the part where the children are pulling the router out of the wall because they want pizza. Yeah, so yeah, the kids are like, yeah, everyone's like, yep, your connection was unstable because the kids are pulling out the router because they want pizza. But the point is, it is interesting to think that if something is, the story of the painting is not there in the painting, right? That's something you kind of know and bring to the painting. And it is interesting to think about, there's something weird of, well, potentially the painting is enhanced by a kind of lack or kind of nothing, which kind of has an excess in a way that kind of pours into the object, which is kind of it, but I'd have to expand on that. But Emilio, Javier, Dimitri, and then if anyone else has final things to say, please.
I just wanted to add that the thing that again with Alex was speaking and Zach is that, for example, this thing about philosophy, and I think because for example, how do you learn philosophy? Like reading a book, right? It, as always, you can change the definition to fit whatever you want, but if we take this definition of reading a book is philosophy, right? You read a book about a philosopher and you internalize that ideas, and that's how it works. It's a mechanism. You read the ideas, you understand them, and then they change the way you view the world, and then you act, and that's good. That's good, right? But the problem is that we don't live in a world just of full ideas, right? We live in a physical 3D space. And I think what is interesting is that, for example, you cannot learn to ride a bike by reading a book. You can learn that you need to pedal the bike, so and you read that in a book, so you can have some previous knowledge of the thing beforehand, but there's some things that can only be understood with experience, right? You can only learn the bike by riding the bike. You can only learn to control anxiety by living in the world and just interacting, and just, it's like tacit knowledge. It lives within you. You cannot communicate it with words in any way, right? So it can only be communicated via experiences. So I think that maybe that's like a counterbalance to philosophy, because you have these ideas, you have these words that are really cool and really useful, and then you have this other part that by definition cannot be explained with words. It can only be felt, it can only be experienced. And I think that's like maybe a counterbalance, because you could say, like, is philosophy useful, is philosophy good? Instead of answering that with philosophy, you take that idea and you go into the world and you experience something, and that experience is what's going to dictate, okay, like philosophy is not good, right? Or philosophy is really cool. So I think that's a kind of like balance thing that could work, that just occurred to me, because the most knowledge that we think is conceptual knowledge. You share these words, these sounds to you, and you think of ideas, and we share knowledge this way. But there's a lot of knowledge that's specifically locked into experience, and we cannot access it until we have that experience. And that's like, yeah, and I think that knowledge is really useful in a lot of things, because you can, I think at least, you cannot learn how to be less anxious, for example, by reading a book. You understand that by interacting with the world and having certain experiences that allow you to be calm in a way. For example, in taking that specific example, I think philosophy is that it has this a balance that is like tacit knowledge or actually experiencing the world. So I just thought that might be a useful idea.
Certainly, if I give my children the idea of eating pizza as opposed to giving them pizza, they inform me that these are not the same. But it is interesting, I will note, Emilio, where you experience the idea of knowing how to ride a bike as if riding a bike. It's really weird that ideas present themselves to you as being equivalent to experience, and that you have to kind of actively fight that. That always kind of mystifies me. But let me give it to Javier and then Dimitri.
Okay. Zach, every time I hear you, man, I'm like, you need to read Buber, man. Everything that you're talking about, this whole idea of like coming back to the world, doing philosophy. Now, because what I really like about even Barnes gets at this too, right? And I did a video on this as well. This idea about doing sincere philosophy. Now, when we talk about the question of Dall-E, right? I get a little bit skeptical in terms of like, I don't think it's a sincere problem for everybody in this room. For example, myself. And the reason why I say that is because there are things in my life, in my present reality, that is more pressing, that is actually a philosophical problem that I have to confront, that is always like in front of me, right? It's always there, right? So what my problem is with, the sort of young people that come into philosophy is that they want to be the next Kant, the next Hegel, to start thinking about like how to construct a new ethics, a new metaphysics, and so on and so on. Like, I mean, sure, if you want to get your, socks off on that stuff. But for me, it's like, if you want to talk about real life, your philosophy problem is always right in front of you. The real question is, what is that problem for you? Now, my problem has always been religion and human relationships. That's a very big tackling. Yeah, so that's just my little side kind of chat on that. But going back to Dall-E, dang, Daniel got me again. He said, if we didn't know if it was made by AI or a human being, what would be the repercussions? Well, I have two speculations. Either the presence itself gets reduced to a trace, right? Because it's such artificially, copied. So it's not the presence of the art, of the relation that is to reality gets reduced to these traces. That means it's still there, but it's just in minuscule, right? But then there's this idea of, well, we've always been copying after the art has been created and passed on. So, and kind of like the homogenization, like Ebert points out. So I'm thinking this, either we look at art as something that we try to have a relationship with, which transcends the material causes, either which that I've done it or the AI does it, meaning that you actually have to establish a narrative or a relation with the actual content of that art itself, which then would imply that maybe it doesn't matter if it's an AI or a human being that creates it, right? But of course, internally, I'm also cringe at me saying that because I also have a hard time, with it. But, that's just my proposal on that. Yeah.
Derrida, I believe it was Derrida, yeah. You really, we're talking about, philosophy and the problem and, are we just, do we just want to enjoy ourselves and are we giving ourselves some excuse when we're intellectual? Well, Derrida said if he could speak with philosophers, he would ask them about their sex lives. That's the first thing he'd do, ask Hegel and all these guys. Now, I've written explicitly about this in the Hegel anthology. And what what I like about sex and philosophy is that, Hegel says that you have to get rid of your bright ideas, to really philosophize, to put it very simply. And when we're, when we're sexual, you can, when we're dealing with real life, it's very clear that you use some pathologies in your relationship, and then you start becoming aware of them, and then you start maybe even repressing them, and you don't talk about it, and then maybe at the end you talk about it. And so there's all these like simple things happening in sexuality that are like, they aren't complex, they don't have lots of variables going on, but there's self-deception going on. So I think that, also alluding to what I said in the IDW, is that for me, like, why Hegel is interesting to me is that he doesn't bring in lots of bright ideas, but he really forces you to stay with the simplicity of every logical moment, whether that's negative or whatever. And sex is also kind of the same. It forces you to be with the actuality of the logical moment, and you don't really have a choice there. So I mean, Daniel, you love to give this example of holding the pen like this, you know. And that's really what it's about. How do you not clutch it and not let it fall? And it's in essence, it's very simple. You know, you can explain it to a child. So I think, you know, as intellectuals, we really have this tendency to deceive ourselves with the confusion and to like get caught up into complexity and bright ideas. But their truth is, of course, actualized through their own negation. And I think, you know, another thing that comes up for me is that is also a very simple thing, is that how, you know, you should be allowed to make failures, because to fear error is to fear truth itself. So you have to do something. But when you do something and you fail, how do you not repeat that failure? And that requires this observant presence. You know, how are you aware with self-related negativity? And it's a constant practice. So that's how I try to do it in my own life. And of course I fail all the time in that process.
Actually, that cues me up perfectly. This is something that I've been thinking about, but it's not fully formed, but it's a hunch, because I study status anxiety a lot. And my hunch is that philosophers, and myself included, are afraid to take stands, determinate stands, because it would negate their capacity for self-relating negativity, right? Because you take a stand, and then you have to be like, no, but I'm in the philosophy chair. I have the removed view. I am the witness, and I see both sides, and I see the play of everything. But when we talk about, and so that's, in that sense, I do see the self-relating negativity as its own bypass, as its own cowardice, potentially even, and as its own rubric for avoidance of really engaging and taking a full-bodied stand for something, knowing that you could be wrong. Because where is the failure really, unless you go ahead and take the stand and take a position that can be felled, right? So I wonder about that, and I wonder why I have not met a philosopher who is not a Armageddonist, or what's his name? Calls a layman, calls himself a end of days, whatever is great term, but who doesn't embrace the full sway of movement, because it's the easiest and strongest position to take, is to embrace all operations, because that way you can't be felled. You can't take a position that someone can chop you down from. And I think that I sense a status anxiety that is running, a current that's running through that, where everyone's actually kind of just afraid to take a stand. Because if you take a stand, then you will be wrong. And back to this AI thing with Wall-E. No one will realize whether or not it's AI if they don't know and they're not told that it's AI. Of course they wouldn't, right? And to the point about, I want to go to a museum where it's real stuff, I wouldn't go if there's AI. Well, guess what? They're going to start adding all kinds of cool features to these museums with AI, right? It's going to be an experiential, three-dimensional, holographic sound and smell and vibrations, and you're going to fucking love it. And your kid's going to be like, Dad, let's go to the museum. And be like, all right, and you go, and you're like, shit, this is pretty dope, actually. Because it's a totally different experience, right? So it will slip away, and I guess I just have this hunch that we don't take stands as philosophers because we're fucking afraid to, because we don't want to be thought of as a lesser philosopher by our peers. I think there's a status anxiety thing going on. That's my hunch.
I want to ask a question. Wouldn't you universalize that? Why particularize that to this group? It is a universal thing, no? Status anxiety.
Of course, but within, there's clubs within clubs, and we have our belonging to the, there's, the steampunks that all hang out in New Orleans. They're apparently very anarchical. They all wear the same goddamn uniform. They literally wear a uniform, and if they were to act in disaccordance with the group to which they belong, which is steampunks, they would be excommunicated from the steampunks, which are an anarchical group that have probably the most explicit codes of behavior, more so than mainstream society. So anyway, as a subgroup, as a nested hierarchy, we have even more stringent protocols and rules for status and belonging than we do to the external and wider groups to which we belong. So the more cloistered and the more sort of nested the hierarchical belonging, the more firm the rubric of status and anxiety and behavioral compliance become.
So, I mean, you can explain that in a Girardian way as well, right? The closer someone is to you, the more you want to kill him and overtake him. So, I've been thinking about behavior. You were talking about in the East, philosophy and religion tended to be the same thing, whereas in the West, this weird thing has emerged where we have separated the two, and then you get all these crazy guys who retroactively change the history of philosophy. Now that means philosophy constantly takes up something that's, you know, kind of apart, like outside of it. And wouldn't you say that that's like to put it very naively, a making conscience of all those things that are implicit? For example, like, you know, in the book that I already talked about this one the last time, I believe, but in the book that Alenka Zupancic published, Zizek in the introduction says, I feel an envious hatred for Alenka Zupancic for writing this book because it's so fucking good, and I wanted to be the one who came up with that. Like, this is, who does this? You know, you can only find this in this certain kind of strand of philosophy with psychoanalysis in the Slovenian school here particularly. So that, would you say that's a good thing? That's a bad thing? How do you view that? Like, we try to take up some impossibility and express it, maybe. It's a very weird activity that we're doing either way.
I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on that just because I have a lot of thoughts on that, but I think it's slightly tangential to probably what I was saying. What I'm saying is that, like, nested hierarchy, the further up you go in a nested hierarchy, the more discrete the passcodes. Like, if you want to get into the speakeasy behind the speakeasy that's inside of the speakeasy, you have to have the password to the password to the password. You have to have the handshake and the whole sort of like patois down so that you can actually get into the fucking place. You belong, you know what I mean? But in terms of, like, once you're in it, you wish you're the first there, the last, like all of these social status dynamics around vanguardship, like who's the first to say it and getting credit and these sorts of things. That stuff is very, you know, I ask myself, for instance, this is a side, like when I first started this band, Edward Sharp, like earnestness was nowhere in pop music. And I was like, the most punk rock thing I can do is be really earnest, right? I was like, this is the most punk rock thing I can do because it's illegal. Because I felt it was the most dangerous, lamest thing I could do. It was the most punk rock thing. But I had to ask myself, and I asked myself this then, if earnestness and love become really popular, and it goes mainstream, and all of a sudden all the bands are ditching irony and sarcasm and suddenly being earnest, will I keep being earnest? Or am I simply addicted to being on the vanguard? Turns out I'm simply addicted to being on the vanguard. I completely, as soon as a bunch of Hondas started being sold with like dun 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 dun, hey, dun 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 dun, and back and forth, I was like, oh my God, get me out of here. You know what I mean? Like, I'm going the other way now. And that was really interesting to note. And I think I think philosophers in general suffer from vanguardism. Otherwise, it wouldn't always be the new idea. Like, we're always subverting one another and being like, yeah, he's right, but he's also wrong. You know, and then we go on our track. And I think we have as a group a sort of vanguard, you know, we're contrarians. Oh, fuck, I got to get on a call. Hey, this has been really fun. I'm sorry I have to split after talking.
You're great, Mr. Ebert. Thank you for being here, sir.
Yeah, just to respond to Dimitri a little bit, because, you know, his concern about philosophy. If Ebert's saying, you know, philosophy can be the standing anxiety where we don't take a stand, I think you could probably say the opposite for religion, right? You do take a stand, but then there's no insight, right? So we can't have one or the other, right? We need insight with a stand. Right, and this is what the significance of Nietzsche and Buber are. Sorry, got to get my last round of Buber in, where they are philosophers of responsibility, right? We think, the reason why we think is because we want to make a choice. And at the end of the day, if we make a wrong choice, well, it doesn't matter. You made a choice, and that's how we develop as human beings. So the whole point is to make a choice. So I think that's, typically what I'm scared about when a bunch of kids get into philosophy is that they get into like this no standing kind of position, but it's like, no, dude, you have to make a choice. You have to, you have to put yourself in the fire. You can't just be like, oh, I see Dante's journey. No, you need to go through Dante's journey. Okay. But yeah, that's my last point.
Yeah, Samuel is saying, "Get off my lawn, kids."
Old man Javier, these damn kids getting into philosophy.
Get off my lawn! You shouldn't be here. So a few things, everyone. I've enjoyed this immensely. Alas, we must run. A few things. Did you want to say anything last, Mr. Barnes?
No, it's been a pleasure.
It has been a pleasure. Actually, everyone should read Mr. Barnes' book, The Iconoclast, because it perfectly fits into a lot of this. A few things. One, a question we do have to ask, though, Javier, where you were saying that why worry about the Dall-E problem, which sounds like the trolley problem. Why worry about the Dall-E problem? Because why don't we have their immediacy? Well, a problem of game theory dynamics is an axis equilibrium where if everyone does what is individually rational for them, you get a suboptimal result. So what if it's the case that because we just care about our immediate philosophy, that results in a suboptimal result where, say, the meta crisis happens, right? We have to consider that. And if we say that's not going to occur, that requires philosophical reasoning to consider. The other thing is, I love the phrase socks off. That's great. I just want to say that one more time. I don't know what you do with your cat at night. You take its socks off. That's great because it's got little fluffy socks. Three, it's interesting to think in Hegel, where if indeed history is a process of the implicit becoming explicit, and philosophy arises precisely as you have greater encounter with diversity or different people that come into trouble. And there's something about philosophy that helps you handle the encounter of diversity, because when you encounter someone who thinks different than you, you go, why do I think the way I think? Why do I believe in like justice or whatever? And it's like, oh, shoot. And then you go from there, right? So there's a question to be asked where if for Hegel, philosophy has a lot to do with interpretation more than change. Are we better off to have the ability to interpret a painting as AI generated or human generated? Or would we better off not to have that ability to interpret painting as such? If we say, because you could make the following argument, what if philosophy arose in this moment in history to get us through globalization and pluralism to the point where technology would arise like Dall-E, at which point we can leave philosophy behind because we don't need to have that interpretive ability. What if philosophy is just a transitory thing that you go through and that came in at the historic moment to give rise to the technology that wouldn't have arisen had you not had philosophy? I'm just trying to be intentionally provocative at this point as we bring the call to a close because I'm a terrible human being. So you have to wonder that. The other thing that I was going to say, other than make fun of Javier again, because it's so much fun, is that there is something about, too, the ability, I wanted to say to Alex's, but Mr. Ebert's point, I think it's really important to understand that concretion in Hegel for the subject must have commitment. Concrete, we tend to think concretion, so you have abstraction, negation, concretion, right? So concrete can just mean like this table. Well, hold on, yes, that is concrete, but for you to actually make something concrete, it requires commitment. So the philosopher who does not actually make what I call the real choice or the commitment or the taking of the stand actually is not a real philosopher in a sense, right? Because they never enter into the concrete. And as we've said 1,000 times, if an abstraction does not become concrete, it's almost not even an idea for Hegel, right? So without the commitment, so this is actually to Hume's point, is it's very difficult for a person to leave common life, go to the ivory tower, get really good abstraction, and then come back and commit to a common life. And common life does not just mean like small town America. You can just take the phrase common life to mean a life, like a life that you commit to and that you see to and that you put in your lot. And that philosophy without that becomes very, very destructive. So I think Mr. Ebert is correct that there is something about philosophy that wants to stay in the above status that then makes philosophy, as Mr. Barnes talks about, a force of destruction, basically, because it wants to stay in the meta question without ever becoming a sub-question. But then if you have a sub-question, you can have a problem because you get a dogmatism, banality of evil. So you have to go back to the meta question, but it's very difficult for philosophers to ever leave the meta question. And we also finally said that there's something about the meta question that seems to be a white hole that is generating, but if we approach too much, it destroys us. And then the very last thing I'll say, I'm always very interested, and I guess we'll tie this with Mr. Ebert. If we look at religions and we think about the veil, like let's take in the temple in Judaism, right? The veil actually signifies not that there's nothing behind it, but that there's an infinity behind it. And that the veil actually has to stay up for that infinity to function in the way it needs to kind of function, right? And it's kind of weird because that kind of blurs the line between infinite and nothing, right? You know, in kind of this kind of veiled tradition. And it is very interesting to go through so many ancient myths and you see locked doors that you shouldn't open, trees that you shouldn't eat from, veils that you shouldn't tear down. And this is all over mythology. And it's very interesting to think because it almost does suggest that there's something about that mythos that is completely proper for philosophy to integrate with, which I think would address some of the meta question, sub-question stuff, that philosophy has forsaken because we're better than those mythos, that actually would have us a relation with nothing in the way that Mr. Ebert is discussing. Where when the veil is up in the temple, it's a white hole. That, because here's the funny thing, Judaism and religions actually function and organize their activity concretely around this thing that's behind a veil. It is generative. There is a creation that comes because of it. And when you tear down the veil, it doesn't work so much. Once you open the door, then and all the mythologies are different things, there's different problems. So there's something about where it seems, and then I'll leave it, where there's a certain mythos that philosophy has left behind that suggests the necessity of I pulled this out of your ear and I didn't even notice. The myth, I'm closing, it doesn't matter anymore, does it? All right. So, that there's this kind of mythos that philosophy has left behind that seems to be necessary for the optimal functioning of philosophy, that once you lose, it becomes a force of destruction. And if you don't have, you end up in a sub-question that can become a fascism or a banality of evil. And then it would seem as if the kind of philosophy that takes that mythos seriously might be advantageous for the dealing of these technologies because it helps us interpret these technologies in a manner that helps us use them well and to hold them in a manner without clutching them. So there does seem to be that philosophy is good, assuming that we are conditioned properly to think of it as a door that we rise to the occasion of having the character not to unlock. But with that, I will go and take my children to have pizza. So thank you so much for your time. I look forward to next week. Everyone, you are beautiful. Thank you for being here. Go get the iconoclast, get the Pérelin Decline, because this book is beautiful. I really love what Pei did at the end regarding memory and the sort of sacrifice. I think it speaks to Raymond Stymos. Notes from a Pod is also very good with Raymond Stymos. He did a great video also on Philip Reef recently. Anyway, you're all beautiful. Thank you for being here. Appreciate it very much. Have a great one, everyone.
Bye.